Welcome back to the Snoozy Scientist, where we calmly explore the forgotten mysteries of our world, one sleepy yawn at a time. Tonight, we're traveling back to a forgotten age, more than 300 million years ago, long before dinosaurs walked the Earth. During a time called the Carboniferous period, our planet was home to creatures so immense, so strange, that they almost sound like fragments of myth, but they were real. Imagine dragonflies the size of hawks, their wings shimmering like stained glass as they hunted the skies. Millipedes longer than a man, rippling across the forest floor like armored trains. Spiders and scorpions so large they seemed born from nightmares, yet they were real, and for millions of years they ruled the swamps, the skies, and the forest floors of a world that now feels alien to us. Scientists have found their traces, dragonflies like Meganeura with wings nearly 70 centimeters across, arthropleura, the colossal millipede, stretching up to 2.5 meters long. These rulers thrived in the forests of the Carboniferous when life was written on a larger, stranger scale. And then, as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. Their reign ended. Their disappearance was not gentle. Something happened, something profound enough to reshape the history of life on Earth. But how? How could insects, bound by delicate exoskeletons and fragile wings, grow to such impossible sizes? What kind of world allowed them to flourish and claim their place as giants? And perhaps most haunting of all, why, after millions of years of dominance, did they vanish? What ended their reign so suddenly and so completely, leaving only fragments in stone and whispers preserved in coal? Tonight, we'll drift softly into that forgotten world to uncover the rise and the fall of the giant insects. But before we begin, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what the time is there. It is always fascinating to think of these stories being heard across so many different skies. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into Earth's distant past, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. A warm thank you as well to those of you who are already subscribed. You're helping this little corner of the internet grow. Now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders ease, and together let's step quietly into the reign of the giant insects. If we could drift upward through the clouds and gaze down at the Earth of 359 million years ago, we would hardly recognize the planet beneath us. From space, the continents were not scattered into familiar shapes like Africa or the Americas. Instead, land masses were clustered into broad, irregular blocks, slowly moving toward one another under the invisible pull of plate tectonics. The supercontinent we know as Pangaea was not yet whole, but its pieces were beginning to gather, closing the ancient seas that had once divided them. Around the waist of the planet, stretching across the equator like a dark green belt, lay immense forests. These forests did not resemble the flowering jungles of the modern tropics. They were built from towering lycophytes and horsetails, plants that rose like pillars with bark-like trunks and crowns of narrow leaves, forming endless swamps that encircled much of the globe. On the ground, the air pressed heavy, thick with moisture, as if the very atmosphere had been steeped in steam. Day after day, the climate remained warm and damp, with little of the sharp contrast we know between summer and winter. There was no ice at the poles, no deep chill to punctuate the rhythm of the year. Instead, the Carboniferous world pulsed with steady humidity, the perfect cradle for the lush vegetation that spread almost without interruption. Rain fell often, feeding rivers that meandered through low-lying floodplains, while stagnant pools and wetlands stretched as far as the eye could see. Walking through such a forest would have felt like entering an alien cathedral. The lycophyte trees rose more than 30 meters high, their trunks ridged and straight like the columns of some ancient temple. At their bases grew ferns with fronds wide enough to drape across the shoulders of a person, if people had existed then to wander among them. Instead, the undergrowth was filled with primitive plants and thick mats of moss, creating a dense and shadowed ground cover. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into soft green light, and in the distance the calls of amphibians echoed through the murk. Everywhere the air smelled of damp wood and rich soil, and beneath that lay the sharp tang of decay. Fallen plants and trees did not rot quickly in the low oxygen swamps. Instead, they sank into the waterlogged earth, layer upon layer, where they were pressed and preserved. Over millions of years, these buried forests would transform into seams of coal, a black stone that we still mine and burn today. But in the Carboniferous period, this slow burial of plants was not yet a resource for humans. It was part of a natural cycle that locked away carbon and helped build the conditions for the strange reign of giant insects and amphibians. The geography of the continents created vast inland basins that filled with water and supported these swamp forests on an unprecedented scale. Imagine a stretch of green and black wetlands reaching from one horizon to the next, the air so saturated that even breathing felt different. The forests were so expansive that from above they seemed to ring the middle of the planet, a living equator that wrapped the earth. Here and there, shallow seas lapped against the edges of the land, bringing tides into contact with dense thickets of trees. Life clung to every niche, from the surfaces of still ponds to the bark of the towering lycophytes. The steadiness of the climate was another key to this thriving ecosystem. Without the deep freezes and scorching seasons that mark our modern world, the Carboniferous remained stable for millions of years. This constancy meant that plants could spread with little interruption, and animals adapted to an environment that did not change abruptly. The forests were both cradle and cage, offering abundance but also trapping life in humid monotony. For the insects that filled the air, this was paradise. For the amphibians that lurked in pools and streams, it was a world of endless hunting grounds. Even the skies must have looked different, hazed with the constant presence of moisture and smoke. Fires kindled easily in the high oxygen atmosphere, flaring through forests in sudden bursts. The evidence of these ancient blazes remains in seams of fossil charcoal, but to creatures alive then, fire was both destroyer and creator. It cleared swathes of forest, allowing new growth to surge up from the damp soil, feeding once more the relentless cycle of vegetation and decay. In this strange balance, Earth became the stage for gigantism. The air was dense, the forests were endless, and the seasons did not shift with the extremes we know today. It was a time when the natural order allowed life to reach scales that now feel impossible. From space, the Carboniferous Earth glowed as a planet swaddled in green, wrapped in equatorial forests that stretched nearly unbroken around its middle. From the ground, it was a dim, damp, cathedral-like world that would soon give rise to some of the most extraordinary creatures the planet has ever seen. And as we wander deeper into these forests, the question grows sharper. What was it about this place, this moment in deep time, that made Earth capable of nurturing such immense life? To understand that, we must look closely at the atmosphere itself and the revolution of oxygen that fueled these towering trees and the colossal insects that followed. In the Carboniferous world, the air itself was extraordinary. Though invisible, it carried a weight that shaped every flame, every leaf, and every living thing. Where today the atmosphere contains just over 1/5 oxygen, the air 300 million years ago swelled to levels as high as 30 to 35%. It was the highest oxygen concentration Earth has ever known. The difference may sound small, but it was profound, creating a world that operated under rules unlike any we see today. Each breath in that era would have felt thicker and richer, the air itself denser than the air we know. A candle lit in such an environment would burn with a brighter, hotter flame. Sparks that would die in our world could leap into full fires under that ancient sky. This unseen abundance was not created overnight, but accumulated slowly, driven by the vast green machinery of the Carboniferous forests. Stretching across the equator were endless swamps, dense with towering lycophytes, horsetails, and ferns. These plants did more than shade the ground and trap moisture. Through the quiet work of photosynthesis, they acted as vast oxygen pumps. Carbon dioxide was drawn in, sunlight was captured, and oxygen was exhaled back into the air in quantities that reshaped the balance of the planet. Unlike modern forests, which are scattered patches across continents, these Carboniferous forests formed a nearly unbroken belt, a living engine that circled the globe. The productivity of these forests was staggering. The sheer density of plant life, growing in humid swamps that encouraged rapid growth, meant that oxygen was produced faster than it could be consumed. Normally, decomposition and respiration would counterbalance photosynthesis, keeping oxygen levels relatively stable. But during the Carboniferous, conditions tipped the scales. Dead plant matter often fell into stagnant waters, where it was buried under layers of mud before it could fully decay. This locked away carbon that would otherwise have returned to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, leaving oxygen free to accumulate. The evidence of this process lies beneath us today. Coal seams, dark ribbons that run deep through the earth, are the compressed remains of those forests. Each seam is a silent archive, recording the abundance of plant matter that was once buried in swampy ground. Coal is not just a source of energy, it is proof that entire ecosystems grew, died, and were entombed without releasing their carbon back into the air. By storing so much carbon underground, the atmosphere tilted ever further toward oxygen enrichment. Geological chemistry provides another line of evidence. Isotopes trapped within ancient rocks record the shifting balance of gases in the atmosphere. Scientists reading these chemical signatures can trace the rise of oxygen with remarkable precision, mapping its peaks and valleys across millions of years. These records confirm that the Carboniferous atmosphere was unique, standing out as a peak of oxygenation in Earth's long history. The consequences of this oxygen-rich world extended far beyond the trees themselves. Fire became a constant companion to the forests. Even damp vegetation, which resists burning in our modern climate, could catch fire more easily when oxygen levels soared. Charcoal deposits preserved in Carboniferous rocks bear witness to ancient wildfires that must have swept across swamps and plains. These fires were not the end of the forests, but part of their rhythm. They cleared patches of land, allowing new plants to sprout and restoring diversity, even as they scarred the land with blackened remains. Oxygen fed not only growth but destruction, entwining life and fire in a cycle of renewal. This fragile balance depended entirely on the health of the forests. As long as the vast swamps thrived, the oxygen pumps continued, filling the skies with their invisible exhalations. If the forests faltered, the atmosphere could shift dramatically, sending ripples through every ecosystem. The earth of the Carboniferous was bound tightly to its green belt of forests, more dependent on plants than at almost any other time. The oxygen revolution was not a single event, but a long transformation that built over millions of years. It created a world of abundance, volatility, and possibility. The air itself was different, thicker and more potent, shaping landscapes in ways that cannot be recreated today. Within this atmosphere, fire burned brighter, forests grew denser, and the stage was set for life to attempt new extremes. To understand how living creatures responded to this oxygen-rich air, we must now look closer at the structures that allowed them to interact with it, and how the very act of breathing became a gateway to gigantism. To understand why insects could ever push their bodies to such extraordinary sizes, we must look closely at the way they breathe. Their system is unlike that of mammals or reptiles. Insects do not inhale through expanding lungs or pump oxygen through blood in the way vertebrates do. Instead, they rely on a direct and delicate network of air filled tubes, known as trachea. Running along the body wall are spiracles, small openings that act as gateways to the outside world. Air enters through these pores and moves into a branching system of tubes that divide again and again, narrowing until they are microscopic. These trachea carry oxygen straight to the tissues that need it, bypassing the bloodstream entirely. Each cell has its own supply line, its own tiny doorway to the atmosphere. It is a design of elegant simplicity, a system that requires no red blood cells, no heart pumping oxygen, no lungs inflating and collapsing. Yet this efficiency carries a hidden cost. Oxygen in these tubes moves not by force, but by diffusion, drifting from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Diffusion is a process that works quickly over very small distances, but slows dramatically as the path lengthens. For tiny insects, diffusion is more than enough to supply their needs. The air slips easily through the trachea, feeding every muscle fiber and organ with little delay. But as an insect grows larger, its tissues lie farther from the spiracles, and the path for oxygen becomes longer. The larger the body, the weaker the efficiency of diffusion becomes. This simple law of physics sets a ceiling on how large an insect can grow under ordinary conditions. Modern insects live within this ceiling. The tracheal system limits them to sizes that can be supported by diffusion in today's atmosphere. A housefly's buzzing wings or a beetle's scuttling legs are powered with ease by oxygen carried only a few millimeters. But no modern insect approaches the scale of the Carboniferous titans, because the same mechanism that allows them to breathe so efficiently at small sizes becomes a barrier as size increases. The structure of the tracheal system itself illustrates the challenge. In many insects, the main trachea branch into every segment of the body, forming a lacework of tubes that can be seen in fine anatomical studies. In cross section, the tubes appear like hollow straws, reinforced with rings to prevent collapse. As they branch into smaller and smaller divisions, they eventually end in tracheals, so fine that they reach directly into the spaces between muscle fibers. In this way, oxygen can slip almost directly into the machinery of movement, while carbon dioxide seeps back out along the same paths. Some modern insects have developed small tricks to extend the power of this system. Larger species, such as grasshoppers, can contract and expand body segments, creating a kind of pumping motion that pushes air deeper into the tracheal network. Certain beetles even open and close spiracles in rhythmic patterns, regulating airflow like bellows. These adaptations show that the tracheal system is not entirely passive, but even with such adjustments, the limits remain. For the giants of the Carboniferous, the same design was stretched close to its breaking point. Their immense bodies demanded more oxygen than simple diffusion could easily provide. To exist at such sizes required conditions that eased the burden on their breathing structures, allowing their trachea to perform beyond what would otherwise be possible. The result was a natural experiment in scale, where physics, biology, and environment intersected to allow forms that no longer walk the earth. It is striking to imagine how the rhythm of life felt inside these colossal bodies. Every spiracle would have opened and closed like a tiny valve, each movement helping to refresh the air within. With every ripple of their muscles, they may have drawn oxygen deeper into their networks of tubes, supplementing the slow creep of diffusion with the mechanical aid of motion. Their breathing was not a separate act, as it is for mammals, but woven into the very structure of their movements. Walking, flying, or simply flexing their bodies may have been part of how they kept oxygen flowing. The tracheal system remains one of the most distinctive features of insects, both ancient and modern. It explains why they are able to dart with such speed, why their reflexes can be so sharp, and also why their sizes are bound to invisible limits. It is a system that excels at small scales, delivering oxygen directly to where it is needed, without the complexity of lungs and blood. But it also explains why gigantism was possible only under conditions that pushed those limits further outward. The Carboniferous world provided that opportunity, and insects expanded into forms that today seem impossible. Their breathing system had not changed, but the rules that governed its effectiveness had. What we see in the fossil record is not chance, but the predictable outcome of biology tested under extraordinary conditions. This was the age when the very act of breathing carried the potential for life to grow immense. To see this most vividly, one need only look up into the Carboniferous sky, where the largest dragonfly of all time spread its wings, its tracheal system sustaining the muscles that powered a hunter unlike any seen before or since. High above the forests of the Carboniferous, where the canopy of lycophytes and ferns stretched unbroken across the horizon, a shadow moved in silence. At first it might have seemed like a bird, but birds had not yet come into being. It was a dragonfly, but not like the delicate insects that flicker across modern ponds. This was Meganeura, a titan of the skies, with wings that stretched nearly 70 centimeters from tip to tip. Its body was long and slender, armed with powerful jaws and immense compound eyes, and it ruled the air as one of the first true aerial predators. The fossil evidence for this creature comes to us in fragments, impressions pressed into stone that once cradled ancient swamps. One of the most famous specimens was uncovered in France in the late 19th century, its delicate wings preserved in fine sediment. The veined structure of those wings reveals a latticework both strong and light, perfectly suited for gliding in sudden bursts of speed. Each fossil carries the imprint of an insect that once skimmed over the Carboniferous wetlands, hunting with precision in an atmosphere thick with oxygen. Meganeura was not merely large by the standards of insects, it was immense by any measure of flight. With wings broader than a human arm span, it filled the role that birds of prey occupy in our world. Its eyes, enormous and multifaceted, could detect the slightest flicker of movement below. In the green glow of the forest canopy, it could spot amphibians wriggling near the water's edge, or smaller insects darting between fronds. Its mandibles were sharp and strong, built for grasping and tearing, and once it fixed upon its quarry, escape was unlikely. The mechanics of its flight were a marvel of nature's engineering. Insects of the Carboniferous relied on direct wing muscles that attached to the bases of their wings, allowing them to move independently in patterns of remarkable agility. Meganeura could hover in still air, glide with its long wings stretched like translucent sails, or dart forward in sudden lunges. This flexibility made it a versatile hunter, equally capable of ambushing prey in dense vegetation or pursuing it in open air above the swamps. Modern dragonflies provide a glimpse of this agility, but scaled up to the size of a hawk, the effect would have been breathtaking. Artistic reconstructions often show Meganeura gliding through cathedral-like forests of giant horsetails and lycophytes, shafts of light cutting down through the mist as its wings caught the glow. Picture it hovering near the edge of a stagnant pool, its shadow rippling across the water as it scanned for movement below. A frog-like amphibian stirred, and in a flash the dragonfly lunged, its legs extending forward like grappling hooks to seize its prey. Such scenes played out countless times, woven into the rhythm of Carboniferous life, as Meganeura asserted itself as one of the apex predators of its world. Its dominance tells us much about the ecosystems of the time. In a world without birds or bats, insects alone claimed the skies. Meganeura sat at the very top of that aerial hierarchy. Smaller insects may have filled the air in buzzing swarms, feeding on plant matter or detritus, but above them all hovered this silent giant. It hunted not only with speed, but with patience, gliding over the swamps with an authority unmatched by any competitor. For millions of years it reigned, leaving no descendants of equal size in later ages. The fossils of Meganeura remind us that the Carboniferous was a period when life was testing boundaries. Oxygen levels allowed creatures to stretch their forms to new extremes, and Meganeura was one of the boldest experiments of all. Its wings were more than tools of flight, they were symbols of an atmosphere that could support such extravagance. Each fossil wing etched in stone is a fragment of that story, a silent testimony to skies once ruled by titans. The presence of this great dragonfly invites us to look further across the Carboniferous world, to see what other creatures shared its realm. And as our attention shifts from the air to the ground, we find another colossus, not a predator, but a gentle giant of the forest floor, leaving behind tracks that still ripple across stone today. Beneath the soaring lycophyte trees and towering ferns of the Carboniferous, the forest floor was no quiet place. It shifted with movement, not from predators lurking in the shadows, but from a very different kind of giant. Where dragonflies ruled the skies, here the crown belonged to Arthropleura, a millipede so vast that it turned the ground itself into a stage for its steady march. Unlike vertebrates, Arthropleura left behind no skeleton of bone to tell its story. Its body was built from chitin and plates of armor, which rarely fossilized. Instead, paleontologists know it largely through the marks it pressed into soft mud. Across ancient floodplains and swamp margins, wide parallel grooves remain etched in stone, trackways that stretch for meters. These were not random scratches, but purposeful trails, each one a signature of a segmented body, dragging forward on countless legs. To walk alongside such a trail in deep time would have been to stand beside the path of a moving wall, its body sliding with quiet determination. At full length, Arthropleura could reach nearly 2.5 meters, far longer than the tallest person of its age. Its body was made of broad, articulated segments, each capped with armor plates that overlapped like shingles on a roof. This design gave it both protection and flexibility. With each ripple of its many legs, the creature glided forward, its body undulating in waves of motion that parted the undergrowth. It did not hunt, nor did it threaten with venom or speed. Instead, it lived as a detritivore, a recycler of the forests, feeding on the endless rain of organic matter that fell from the canopy above. The Carboniferous forest was a place of abundance, where leaves, stems, and branches rained down in a constant cycle. In that environment, Arthropleura thrived. It fed on rotting wood, soft plant tissues, and fallen fronds. Its enormous gut was a furnace for decay, processing the litter that blanketed the forest floor. In doing so, it played a role far larger than its own size suggested. By fragmenting and consuming the debris, it helped return nutrients to the soil, fueling the roots of the very trees that shed the leaves it ate. Arthropleura was more than a giant millipede. It was a keystone of the ecosystem, a quiet engine that recycled the forest from the ground up. Its scale alone set it apart from anything alive today. Modern millipedes, even the largest tropical species, rarely grow beyond 30 centimeters. Arthropleura was nearly 8 times that size, stretching across the ground like a living log. Imagine an amphibian, no larger than a cat, crossing paths with such a creature. To that small hunter, Arthropleura would have seemed like a barrier, armored and immense, yet harmless in intent. For smaller insects scuttling through the litter, its passage must have felt like the approach of a moving landscape, a shadow that rippled the ground as it advanced. The body plan of Arthropleura helped it master the swampy terrain. Its many legs spread its weight across the soft earth, preventing it from sinking into mud. The flat armored plates shielded it from the thorns of vegetation, and perhaps even from the bites of smaller opportunists. Its slow, methodical pace was not weakness, but an adaptation to a world where energy was plentiful in fallen plants, rather than in prey. What makes Arthropleura so compelling today are its trackways. Each preserved trail captures a moment when the animal pressed its segmented body into wet earth, leaving grooves that hardened and survived for hundreds of millions of years. Some tracks wander across open flats, others curve through what were once forest margins, and still others lead toward the edges of vanished rivers. To stand before these stone trails is to glimpse movement fossilized, the path of a creature that carried the forest's decay in its body and left behind only the memory of its steps. In the Carboniferous world, Arthropleura shared the floor with other invertebrate giants, but few could rival its sheer presence. Above, dragonflies glided with wingspans wider than a human arm. At the edges of swamps, amphibians prowled for prey. Yet on the ground itself, no animal could match the size and quiet dominance of this armored detritivore. It was not a predator, not a destroyer, but a recycler on an epic scale, the lord of a kingdom built from fallen leaves and humid shadows. The great millipede remains one of the most vivid reminders of how alien Earth once was. Its trackways tell us not only that it lived, but how it lived, a giant gliding silently through a world of green light and mist, feeding on the debris of towering forests, shaping the very soil beneath its many legs. The Carboniferous forests did not belong to a single giant. They were filled with many, each more peculiar and astonishing than the last. Beyond the sweeping shadow of Meganeura and the long ripple of Arthropleura, the undergrowth, the swamps, and even the shadows of the night teemed with other creatures that had taken advantage of the rich air and the endless damp. Gigantism was not a rare accident, it was the common pattern of life in this world. Among the most abundant were the cockroaches, not the small skittering insects that hide in our kitchens today, but creatures that grew to sizes that would cover the span of an open hand. These ancient cockroaches thrived in the litter of the swamp forest, feeding on decaying vegetation, hiding beneath rotting logs, and spreading their wings to glide short distances when threatened. Their flattened bodies and hardened forewings made them survivors in an environment where food was plentiful and predators had not yet mastered the art of controlling the air. Fossils of their wings, often beautifully preserved, show the veined patterns of creatures that once buzzed in swarms through the Carboniferous night. Beetles, too, though still primitive compared to their modern diversity, had already begun to carve out their role in these ecosystems. Some grew to remarkable sizes, their shells thick and ridged, their jaws adapted for chewing through the fibrous plant material that covered the ground. In this world of endless green, beetles and cockroaches were the recyclers, the hidden workforce that helped return the forest's abundance back into the soil. Their size was not a hindrance but an advantage, giving them strength to process the dense vegetation that lay all around them. Not all of the giants of this world were harmless. In the shadows lurked Pulmonoscorpius, the giant scorpion. Unlike the cockroaches and beetles, this was a predator, creeping across the damp ground with claws extended and tail arched. Fossils suggest that Pulmonoscorpius could reach more than half a meter in length, larger than many small mammals today. Its name means lung scorpion, a reminder that it breathed air through book lungs, a system of layered plates where gases could pass directly into the blood. This adaptation allowed it to venture confidently onto land, where it hunted amphibians and smaller arthropods. Imagine the glint of its carapace under the dim green canopy, the scrape of its claws across wet stone, the sudden strike of its tail delivering venom into struggling prey. In a world where vertebrates had only just begun to expand, Pulmonoscorpius was already a master of ambush. Alongside it crawled centipedes that dwarfed their modern relatives. These fast-moving hunters were long, segmented, and equipped with venomous forcipules, the modified front legs that delivered their bite. In the high oxygen atmosphere, Their bodies could stretch longer, their movements quicker, their strikes deadlier. A centipede a meter long slipping through the leaf litter would have been a formidable sight, both elegant and frightening in the same moment. They too had their role in the forest, keeping populations of other invertebrates in check and asserting the balance between predator and prey. There were also creatures stranger still, silverfish like insects that had grown to unnatural proportions. Today, silverfish are small, darting animals that slip through the crevices of homes, but in the Carboniferous, their ancestors were giants. These wingless insects, armored with overlapping scales, scuttled across the forest floor, shining faintly under the filtered light. Their large size speaks again to the unique conditions of the time, when even humble forms of life tested the limits of what was possible. Taken together, these creatures show that gigantism was not confined to a few extraordinary species, but spread widely across the insect and arthropod world. The forests of the Carboniferous were alive with immense cockroaches rustling in the undergrowth, beetles gnawing through fallen stems, scorpions lurking in the shadows, centipedes flowing like ribbons of legs across the soil, and silverfish like giants darting across the litter. Each was shaped by the same invisible hand, the richness of the atmosphere, and the constancy of the swamps that provided food and shelter without end. The abundance of large arthropods made the Carboniferous forest a place of constant motion and sound. The whir of wings, the clicking of armored plates, the steady ripple of countless legs must have formed a chorus unlike anything known today. This was not the occasional appearance of an outlier, but the everyday reality of a world where oxygen tipped the scale in favor of size. In this age of giants, the ground and air were equally crowded with forms that stretched the boundaries of life, each one reminding us of how different Earth once was. As we follow these forests further, it becomes clear that the source of all this gigantism lay in the green world itself. The coal forests, vast and unbroken, did more than shape the atmosphere. They created the stage upon which every giant insect and arthropod performed. To understand how this worked, we must look more closely at the forests themselves, the engines of oxygen that powered the reign of these ancient titans. The true engines of the Carboniferous world were not the giant insects that filled its skies, or the amphibians that prowled its waters. They were the forests themselves, immense and unbroken, rising from the swamps like living walls of green. These forests stretched across the equator in bands so dense they seemed to wrap the earth, their canopies blotting out sunlight and their roots reaching deep into the soggy soil. They were unlike any forests we know today. The dominant trees were lycophytes, relatives of modern club mosses, but swollen to proportions that would seem unreal if not for the fossils that remain. Some towered more than 30 meters high, their trunks covered in diamond-shaped patterns left by fallen leaves, and their crowns spreading thin fronds at the very top like umbrellas. Horsetails, too, ancestors of plants that now grow small and inconspicuous, rose as thick, jointed columns, their branches radiating in whorls like spokes of a wheel. Ferns filled the spaces between, their wide fronds draping like curtains over the understory. In this world of constant warmth and humidity, the forests grew with relentless energy. Each day, millions upon millions of leaves absorbed the sunlight, transforming it into sugars, building tissues, and in the process exhaling oxygen. The scale of this productivity was immense. These forests were factories, churning out oxygen far faster than it could be consumed. Animals breathed it, fires devoured it, yet still it accumulated. Over millions of years, this constant pumping of oxygen tipped the balance of the atmosphere, raising it far above the levels of today. The air became thick with life's byproduct, and with it came the conditions that allowed gigantism to flourish. The story of these forests is written not only in the fossils of towering trunks, but also in the coal beds buried beneath our feet. When the trees of the Carboniferous fell, many did not decompose quickly. The swampy ground was waterlogged, lacking the oxygen needed for microbes to fully break down wood and leaves. Instead, the dead plants sank into mud, forming layers of peat that built up year after year. Over millions of years, the pressure of overlying sediments compressed these layers into seams of coal. Today, miners dig deep into the earth to extract this black stone, a fossil fuel born from ancient forests. But in the Carboniferous, it was still fresh, peat-rich ground waiting to be buried. These coal forests were the lungs of the planet. Their sheer scale made them a global force, reshaping not only the landscape but the very air itself. Every fallen lycophyte, every fern that collapsed into the swamp, was a fragment of carbon removed from circulation and locked away underground. For each piece of carbon trapped, more oxygen remained free in the air. The forests did not simply cover the land, they rewrote the atmosphere, raising oxygen to levels that no later period of Earth's history has matched. The presence of such forests also created habitats of extraordinary complexity. The canopy shaded the swamp floor, leaving it damp and dim. Pools collected beneath fallen logs, and rivers wound slowly through dense stands of vegetation. Amphibians lurked in these waters, insects clung to bark, and predators like Pulmonoscorpius waited in the shadows. Every niche was filled, and every living creature was touched by the forest's influence. They provided food, shelter, and the oxygen-rich air that made life more vigorous. Imagine the daily rhythm within these forests. As sunlight rose, the plants stirred into action, their leaves opening and turning to the light, pumping oxygen into the already heavy air. By night, when photosynthesis ceased, the forests exhaled moisture, cloaking the swamps in fog. The cycle repeated endlessly, a pulse that beat across millions of years, steadily fueling the rise of giants. Without these forests, Meganeura could not have spread its wings across the skies, and Arthropleura could not have rippled its armored body through the undergrowth. The insects and arthropods of the Carboniferous were tied to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere was tied to the forests. Each giant was, in truth, a shadow of the green engines that sustained it. As the forests continued their endless labor, their buried remains accumulated silently below, forming the vast coal seams that modern humans would one day uncover. But in their own time, they were simply part of the living landscape, immense stands of vegetation driving the oxygen cycle forward. Their presence reminds us that the true architects of Earth's history have often been plants, shaping the stage upon which animals act. The dominance of these forests created a climate of abundance, yet it was also fragile. Stable warmth and endless growth could not last forever. Beneath this steady rhythm lay the seeds of change, for as the forests expanded and contracted with shifting seas and climates, their control over the atmosphere would be tested. And with that test came the beginnings of the instability that would one day bring the reign of giants to its slow decline. The Carboniferous world was shaped as much by its climate as by its forests. The air was heavy with warmth and moisture, and the globe itself was tilted in such a way that the equatorial belt was locked in an almost endless summer. Across this wide band, the climate remained warm and damp, a greenhouse without frost, where humidity hung in the air and clouds rolled constantly above the endless greenery. To live in that world was to live in a planet that sweated, every breath drawn thick with water vapor, every horizon darkened by the haze of mist rising from swamps. Rain was the heartbeat of these forests. It came not as delicate showers, but as seasonal pulses, drenching the land with torrents that filled lowlands, swelled rivers, and turned floodplains into broad wetlands. The forest drank deeply, and in turn offered back even more water, their vast leaves exhaling moisture into the atmosphere. This cycle created an almost perpetual damp, where ground rarely dried and skies rarely cleared. In this rhythm, the forests thrived, rising higher and spreading wider with each new surge of rain. The consistency of the Carboniferous climate meant that life could flourish with little interruption, unlike today, where winters and summers demand that creatures adapt to change. The ancient swamps offered stability. Animals did not need to prepare for frost or drought. Plants did not wither under seasonal extremes. Instead, the environment pulsed with the predictable rise and fall of swamp waters, each pulse marking a slow, steady rhythm across millions of years. Clues to this climate are hidden in the growth rings of fossilized wood, just as trees today record the passage of seasons in concentric bands. So too did the lycophytes and other giants of the Carboniferous. But their rings tell a story of remarkable stability. The variations are faint, showing that the shifts between wet and dry, between light and dark, were muted compared to the seasonal swings we know. It was a world in equilibrium, a greenhouse earth that sustained its forests and fueled the constant production of oxygen. This relative stability explains why the coal forests could dominate for such an extended time. With little disruption, the plants grew without pause, layering one generation upon another and feeding the atmospheric engine that made giant insects and arthropods possible. For millions of years, this climate offered life a steady stage on which to experiment with size and form. Yet even stability carries fragility. A system that depends on constancy is vulnerable when the balance begins to shift. And in the Carboniferous, the seeds of change were already stirring beneath the surface. Continental plates moved slowly but steadily, altering coastlines and reshaping the pathways of moisture. Vast inland seas shifted, retreating in places, advancing in others. These changes altered rainfall patterns, straining the predictable cycles that the forests depended upon. Fossil evidence hints at moments when this delicate equilibrium was disturbed. Layers of sediment show interruptions in swamp deposits, times when peat did not accumulate, when forests thinned and swamps dried. Growth rings, too, once uniform, reveal episodes of greater stress, suggesting intervals when water became scarce or when climate grew less forgiving. The Carboniferous was not immune to the larger forces that govern Earth. Even in its long stability, it carried within it the possibility of disruption. The rains that had been a steady pulse could falter, and the warmth that had been constant could shift as continents moved closer together. These slow changes would eventually reshape the very stage upon which the giants lived. For now, though, in the heart of the Carboniferous, the climate remained a warm, damp cradle, its rhythm dictated by the steady return of rain and the unbroken presence of swamps. The stability of this world was the foundation upon which its giants stood, but hidden in its balance was the potential for fire, for collapse, and for transformation. To glimpse that, one need only look at the charcoal locked in ancient rock, the evidence of firestorms that burned hotter and brighter than anything seen today. The Carboniferous world was cloaked in endless forests, swamps, and green shadows, yet hidden in that abundance was a danger that could erupt without warning. In an atmosphere so thick with oxygen, fire behaved in ways that would feel alien to us today. A single bolt of lightning striking a dry branch, or the sudden fall of a tree rubbing against another, was enough to unleash a blaze that grew with terrifying speed. These fires were not quiet, creeping events, but roaring infernos that could turn a lush swamp into a furnace in the span of hours. In our time, where oxygen makes up just over 1/5 of the air, flames need dry fuel and careful conditions to spread. In the Carboniferous, With oxygen climbing toward 1/3 of the atmosphere, those same flames leapt higher, burned hotter, and consumed even damp vegetation, moist logs and water-laden fronds that today would resist a flame could catch and burn in those forests. It meant that every storm held the potential for catastrophe, for fire that could sweep across miles of fern and lycophyte in a single surge. To imagine such a fire is to picture walls of flame towering above the swamp canopy. Giant ferns and horsetails, some reaching the height of small trees, shriveled and curled in seconds. Lycophyte trunks blackened and cracked, their hollow interiors collapsing as sparks scattered upward. Smoke poured into the sky, mixing with the heavy humidity to create a haze that dimmed the sunlight. Ash fell like dark snow, settling on the waters of the swamps where amphibians hid and insects darted through the thick air. Yet even as destruction unfolded, these fires were also part of the rhythm of the Carboniferous landscape. Flames cleared vast swaths of forest, opening the canopy that had sealed the swamps in shadow. Where the green roof had once blocked the light, gaps appeared, letting sunshine strike the forest floor in sudden, brilliant shafts. In those spaces, new plants surged upward, quick-growing ferns and pioneer species racing to claim the bare ground. The fires burned hot, but the cycle they triggered renewed the forest, weaving destruction into growth. For the animals of the time, firestorms were both terror and opportunity. Giant insects such as dragonflies could take to the air above the smoke, circling newly opened spaces where smaller prey fled without shelter. Amphibians, crawling between smoldering logs and cooling ash, found their hunting grounds altered in a single night. The immense detritivores of the forest floor, like arthropleura, encountered fresh litter and newly fallen trunks to feed on once the flames passed. In this way, fire became a sculptor of ecosystems, reshaping them again and again. The key to this cycle was oxygen itself. It was oxygen that allowed plants to grow so densely, locking away carbon in their tissues, and it was oxygen that fed the blazes when those tissues ignited. In this paradox lay the character of the Carboniferous. The same invisible element that gave breath to giants also powered the flames that could topple them. Oxygen was abundance, but it was volatility too. The forest floor might have seemed wet, the swamps eternal, yet with oxygen so high, even soggy ground could not always resist combustion. Living in this environment meant constant vigilance. Lightning storms were common in the equatorial belt, and each strike carried danger. A quiet swamp alive, with the drone of insects and the calls of amphibians, could, in an instant, transform into a roaring inferno. The creatures of this age had no control over these forces. They lived within them, adapted around them, and in many ways depended on the clearings and regrowth that fire created. These firestorms left no written record, no survivors' tales, yet their presence is undeniable in the rhythm of the ancient forests. Flames shaped the Carboniferous just as surely as roots, leaves, and rain. Every new green surge of life carried the memory of fire. Every ash-filled clearing became the cradle of renewal. And in this balance of abundance and volatility, insects and plants found themselves bound together, thriving in a world where the very air gave as much danger as it did life. The fires that raged through the Carboniferous forests cleared space and created new opportunities, but the greatest transformation of all came not from flames or even from the forests themselves. It came from the insects, who unlocked a power that no animal before them had ever possessed. They learned to fly, long before birds spread their feathers or bats stretched skin between their fingers. Insects had already claimed the skies. They were the pioneers of the air, testing and perfecting wings in a world still dominated by swamp and fern. The first wings were small and uncertain. Fossils show that they likely began as extensions of the exoskeleton, flaps of cuticle along the body that might have helped with thermoregulation or gliding from one perch to another. Over time, these flaps grew stronger and more articulated until they became capable of true flight. Once an insect could lift itself into the air, even for brief moments, the advantage was enormous. A creature that could rise above the ground could escape predators, search wider for food, and disperse its offspring to distant places. The design of insect wings was elegant. Veins of chitin reinforced thin membranes, creating structures both light and durable. Muscles anchored to the thorax pulled and flexed, driving the wings in complex patterns. Some species used direct muscles attached at the base of the wings, giving precise control of movement, while others evolved indirect muscles that deformed the thorax itself, allowing rapid beats. With these innovations, insects could not only glide, but hover, dart, and maneuver with agility. The forest canopy became a three-dimensional space, open to exploration in ways that crawling alone could never achieve. Fossilized wings are among the most delicate treasures from this time. Impressions in ancient shale preserve the fine lattice of veins, each line a record of the evolutionary experiments in flight. Some wings were broad and leaf-like, useful for gliding on humid air. Others were narrower and more rigid, designed for speed and control. These fossils speak to a period of extraordinary innovation, when insects were not yet constrained by competition from vertebrates and could explore aerial niches freely. Each preserved wing is a fragment of deep history, a reminder that the conquest of the skies was not sudden but gradual, shaped by countless small refinements. The effect on ecosystems was profound. Once insects could fly, they connected parts of the forest that had once been isolated. They carried spores and pollen across distances, though flowering plants had not yet evolved, and spread the reproductive cells of ferns and seed ferns. They became the first true aerial predators, sweeping down on smaller insects, and the first prey of those who would later follow them into the skies. The Carboniferous world shifted from a two-dimensional plane of ground and water into a layered environment that included the open air. Life began to stretch upward, not just in the towering trees, but in the movement of creatures that could fill the space between canopy and ground. The ability to fly also allowed insects to spread across continents. Swamp forests were vast but patchy, broken by rivers and shallow seas. Winged insects could cross these gaps, carrying genes and lineages to new regions, ensuring that their dominance was not local but global. Fossil beds show evidence of similar species scattered across wide areas, testimony to the mobility that flight provided. In the damp air of the Carboniferous, flight must have seemed almost effortless. The dense atmosphere supported large wings, giving stability in hover and glide. The world was primed for such innovation, and insects took full advantage. They rose above the fires, above the swamp waters, above the crawling giants of the forest floor. With wings shimmering in filtered sunlight, they added a new dimension to life on Earth. The skies were theirs alone for millions of years. No vertebrate had yet risen to challenge them. The sound of their wings filled the humid air, a constant whisper over the chorus of amphibians and the rustle of plants. It was a world newly opened, and insects had been the ones to open it. But while insects filled the skies, the swamps below were changing as well. In those waters and mud banks, new creatures were testing their own adaptations, stepping further onto land, and growing into forms that would one day alter the balance of power. Along the quiet waters of the Carboniferous swamps, something remarkable was stirring. For hundreds of millions of years, vertebrate life had been confined to the oceans, its movement dictated by fins and tides. But now, in this strange world of endless green, animals were learning to push past the boundary of water, hauling themselves onto land with limbs rather than flippers. These were the amphibians, the first vertebrates to claim a foothold in the forests and marshes that insects had already filled with sound and motion. The amphibians of this time bore only a passing resemblance to the frogs and salamanders we know today. Many were wide-bodied creatures with flat heads and long, sprawling limbs that carried them across muddy banks. Their skin was soft and permeable, never straying far from damp ground or shallow pools, for they depended on moisture to survive. Their eyes often sat high on their skulls, peering just above the waterline, while their jaws, armed with rows of small teeth, were suited to grasping whatever slipped within reach. Fossils show us strange forms like Crassigyrinus, with its eel-like body and reduced limbs, as if caught halfway between fish and land dweller, and Ariops, heavier and sturdier, built to support its weight on land while still moving with ease in water. To walk through the swamps of the Carboniferous was to move in a world reshaped by their presence. Amphibians lurked in shallow ponds, basked on half-submerged logs, and pressed their bodies into the soft mud at the water's edge. They were creatures of the threshold, not yet free from the pull of water, but no longer entirely bound to it. Each one carried with it the story of transition, of bones and muscles evolving to lift a body into new realms of possibility. The swamps offered them both refuge and opportunity. Dense vegetation lined the banks, giving cover from above, while the waters themselves teemed with fish and invertebrates. Amphibians were opportunists, taking advantage of the wealth of life around them. Their diets were varied, including fish darting beneath the surface, small crustaceans in the shallows, and insects that strayed too near the water's edge. Dragonflies skimming the surface, unaware of danger below, could vanish in an instant. Beetles and cockroach-like insects moving across fallen leaves might suddenly find themselves within range of a flat-bodied hunter hidden in the mud. Yet amphibians were more than hunters. They were also prey, vulnerable in their own way. Their soft skin, while useful for absorbing oxygen, made them delicate. Their eggs, laid in water or moist ground, lacked the protective shells that reptiles would later develop, and so their young had to grow in watery nurseries. They depended on the stability of swamp ecosystems, on the perpetual dampness of a world where rivers spilled into forests and rain fed pools across the land. Their lives were stitched tightly to the rhythms of water and vegetation, inseparable from the places that gave them shelter. The presence of amphibians began to change the balance of the Carboniferous. Until this time, arthropods had moved largely unchecked across the forest floors and swamp margins. Now, a new type of vertebrate was present, one with internal skeletons, articulated joints, and the ability to maneuver both on land and in water. The interactions were subtle rather than overwhelming. Insects still thrived in vast numbers, filling the skies and the undergrowth, but amphibians added complexity to the living tapestry, weaving vertebrates into an ecosystem once dominated by invertebrates alone. Some amphibians were small and agile, darting after tiny prey, while others grew larger, stretching nearly 2 meters in length. Their forms reflected the varied habitats of the Carboniferous swamps. Narrow-bodied swimmers threaded their way through submerged forests, while squat, heavy species pushed through tangles of roots and reeds. Fossil evidence from trackways shows them dragging their bellies through mud, leaving shallow impressions that reveal not just their presence, but their habits. These trails tell of creatures exploring new ground, testing new opportunities and leaving marks that echo through geological time. For insects, this was the beginning of a new relationship. Where once the primary challenges had been finding food, avoiding rivals, and surviving the fires that swept through forests, now they shared their world with vertebrates who occupied both water and land. It was not yet the era of overwhelming predatory pressure, but it was the opening act of coexistence, where insects learned to navigate the presence of larger animals that moved differently, thought differently, and shaped the environment in new ways. The amphibians of the Carboniferous remind us of transition, of a moment when the rules of life on Earth were shifting. They were pioneers, straddling two worlds, not yet masters of land, yet no longer confined to the sea. Their footprints, bones, and fossilized skulls capture the uncertainty and promise of this era. They were fragile, powerful, awkward, and extraordinary all at once. And as they spread through the swampy labyrinths, the ecosystems of Earth began to change, setting the stage for what would come next, when reptiles would step forward and push the boundaries even further. In the lush swamps of the Carboniferous, where amphibians thrived in the shadows of giant ferns and lycophytes, a quieter revolution was unfolding. It began not with towering size or fearsome jaws, but with something far more subtle, hidden inside fragile shells no larger than a fist. Within these shells lay the future of life on land. This was the beginning of the reptiles, small creatures whose innovations would eventually transform the course of Earth's history. The defining breakthrough was the amniotic egg, a structure that seemed simple on the surface, yet carried immense power. Unlike the soft, jelly-like eggs of amphibians that had to be submerged in ponds or streams, the amniotic egg was a self-contained world. It was encased in a protective outer shell, sometimes leathery, sometimes harder, and within it lay a suite of membranes that supported life in remarkable ways. One membrane supplied oxygen to the developing embryo, another stored waste, a third cushioned and nourished the growing young. Together, these adaptations created a portable aquatic cradle, an environment that no longer required external water. With this innovation, reptiles broke a chain that had bound vertebrates since the dawn of their existence. They no longer had to cluster near wetlands to breed. They could climb higher ground, venture into drier clearings, or explore upland regions that had been out of reach for amphibians. The amniotic egg gave them the freedom to lay their young in soil, under roots, or in the shelter of fallen logs, far from the watchful eyes of water-bound predators. It was more than an egg, it was a passport to independence. The earliest known reptiles, such as Hylonomus, were not giants. Fossils discovered in the hollow stumps of Carboniferous trees reveal creatures scarcely longer than a human hand. They were slender, quick, and insect-eating, their sharp teeth perfect for snapping up the abundance of arthropods that filled the undergrowth. Their bones were light but sturdy, their limbs adapted for scurrying over leaf litter rather than swimming through weedy ponds. To see one darting across the forest floor would have been to glimpse a small, almost lizard-like figure weaving between roots and decaying fronds. Their outward appearance may not have been dramatic, but every step they took was weighted with possibility. Where amphibians paused at the edge of ponds to breed, reptiles moved freely into new habitats, no longer tethered to water for their survival. Their skin, reinforced with scales, slowed the loss of moisture, letting them withstand drier air and harsher conditions. Their muscles and skeletons were designed for walking with greater efficiency across solid ground. These small changes, taken together, shifted the balance of life's trajectory. In the Carboniferous world, Dominated by swamp forests and towering plants, reptiles did not yet dominate. They lived quietly alongside amphibians, filling small niches, scurrying through fallen leaves, and hunting insects among the shadows. But their adaptability set them apart. Each amniotic egg that hatched on dry ground was a statement of independence, a small act of defiance against the old limits of water-bound life. This independence was not just ecological, it was evolutionary. The reptiles of the Carboniferous carried within them the beginnings of lineages that would later become lizards, crocodiles, turtles, and eventually dinosaurs and birds. Their small frames concealed vast futures. In this age, they were still modest in scale, but they were already pioneers of a new world, charting a path beyond the reach of amphibians. The forests of the Carboniferous cradled their first steps. Hollow stumps became shelter, upland soils became nurseries, and insect-rich undergrowth provided a steady source of food. With every generation, reptiles tested the boundaries of where life could go, inching into landscapes that had remained untouched. They were still only one piece of a vibrant ecosystem dominated by insects and amphibians, but their presence marked a turning point. As geological forces began to reshape the continents, raising mountains and altering coastlines, reptiles would find themselves prepared for change. The very features that gave them freedom from water also made them resilient to shifts in climate and terrain. In time, their independence would allow them to expand far beyond the forests where they first appeared. For now, in the late Carboniferous, they were still small and unobtrusive, yet already carrying the seeds of futures that would outlast the giants of their age. As reptiles tested their independence on land and insects filled the skies, the ground beneath them was far from still. The Carboniferous world looked stable on the surface, with endless forests of lycophytes and ferns stretching toward the horizon, but deep inside the planet, colossal forces were at work. The continents were not fixed in place, but carried slowly across the globe by the restless motion of plate tectonics. The forests and swamps of the Carboniferous were part of a shifting puzzle, and with every movement, the stage for life was subtly altered. From space, Earth at this time would have looked unfamiliar. The landmasses were clustered closer together than they are today, steadily moving toward the formation of a supercontinent that geologists later named Pangaea. The equator was lined with green belts of swampy forests, but to the north and south, coastlines were constantly being redrawn by the rise and fall of shallow seas. With each shift, new environments opened while others closed, and creatures had to adjust to a landscape that was never quite permanent. The slow collision of land masses gave rise to mountain chains that cut across the face of the world. In what is now North America and Europe, vast ranges began to rise as continents pressed together. The Alleghanian orogeny, for example, formed the ancient roots of the Appalachian Mountains. These towering uplifts disrupted weather patterns, diverted rivers, and reshaped habitats on a continental scale. Where once there had been endless swamps, now ridges and valleys created mosaics of ecosystems. Insects, amphibians, and reptiles alike had to navigate these new barriers, their ranges fragmented by cliffs and highlands. Changes in coastlines told another story. The shallow inland seas that once covered large parts of the continents advanced and retreated with shifting tectonics and sea levels. When the seas receded, they left behind fertile lowlands where swamp forests flourished. When they returned, they drowned those forests under brackish waters, preserving layers of organic material that would eventually turn to coal. Sediment layers record these cycles, alternating bands of sandstone, shale, and coal seams that whisper of rising tides and falling shores. These patterns, still visible in rock strata today, are the diary of Earth's restlessness. Geography dictated where life could thrive and where it struggled. In the lowlands, humidity and warmth remained stable, allowing insects and giant arthropods to flourish. But in the uplands, where soils were thinner and water less abundant, the earliest reptiles began to take advantage of drier conditions. Plate tectonics was not just moving landmasses, it was redistributing opportunity, giving some creatures room to expand while forcing others to retreat. Each shift in the land's shape created new winners and losers in the story of life. The evidence for these geological shifts lies not only in the mountains we see today, but in the paleomaps and fossil layers that scientists study. Ancient sandstones preserve ripple marks from vanished shorelines, while mudstones carry the impressions of roots from forests long gone. Coal seams trace the outlines of vast swamps, while marine fossils suddenly appear in places that were once dry land, revealing the ebb and flow of shallow seas. Together, these layers act like pages in a book, showing us how the continents moved and how life responded in turn. The Carboniferous was a time when Earth itself was a restless architect, raising mountains, erasing coastlines, and stitching together continents into a form that would shape the future of life for hundreds of millions of years. The creatures that lived through this time may not have understood the forces beneath their feet, but they felt the effects in the forests that rose and fell, in the rivers that carved new paths, and in the habitats that appeared and disappeared with each tectonic breath. As the land continued to change, the forests preserved in these layers became treasure houses for the scientists of today. The rocks hold fossils in exquisite detail, snapshots of the lives that once flourished in those shifting landscapes. And within these coal-rich seams and sedimentary records, paleontologists have uncovered not only the remains of insects and amphibians, but also the earliest reptiles, creatures caught in the act of adapting to Earth's moving stage. The world of the Carboniferous is long gone, yet its traces remain hidden in places where we least expect them. Much of what we know about this age does not come from cliffsides or desert outcrops, but from deep within the earth, in seams of coal and layers of stone uncovered by miners and scientists. These seams, formed from the compressed remains of ancient swamps, act as time capsules, preserving the outlines and impressions of life that thrived more than 300 million years ago. Each discovery is less like a relic and more like a page torn from a diary written by the forests themselves. Coal mines have provided some of the richest windows into this forgotten world. When miners split apart blocks of black stone, they often revealed patterns pressed into the rock with startling clarity. The trunks of lepidodendron, the towering scale trees, left behind diamond-shaped markings etched deep into the coal. Calamites, the giant horsetails, appear as ridged impressions, their straight vertical grooves a fossil echo of stalks that once reached skyward. Stigmaria, the root systems of these plants, spread across rock faces in tangled webs, evidence of forests that anchored entire ecosystems in the swampy soil. These impressions are so common in coal seams that even a single mine wall can feel like a mural of the ancient forest floor. Yet it is not only the plants that remain. Arthropods and amphibians also found their way into these archives, often preserved in surprising detail. In some layers, the delicate wings of dragonflies appear, their fine veins still visible as though ready to lift into flight once more. Slabs of stone have revealed the imprints of cockroaches and silverfish-like insects, their bodies pressed flat against the sediment that entombed them. The trackways of arthropleura, wide and parallel grooves running across ancient mud, record the slow march of a creature longer than a human. Each track is a frozen moment, a trace of movement locked in stone for millions of years. Some fossil sites are especially famous for the treasures they hold. Mason Creek in Illinois, for example, is one of the most remarkable windows into Carboniferous life. Here, organisms were preserved in ironstone nodules, forming natural protective shells around their remains. When split open today, these nodules reveal exquisitely detailed fossils, including insects, soft-bodied animals, and even rare imprints of their internal structures. What makes Mazon Creek extraordinary is the diversity it captured, offering a snapshot of entire ecosystems rather than just isolated species. It is one of the few places where we can see not only the giants of the Carboniferous, but also the smaller creatures that shared their world. The conditions of the Carboniferous swamps created an environment where fossilization was unusually common. The wetlands were waterlogged and low in oxygen, which slowed the decay of organic matter. Plants and animals that fell into these environments often became buried quickly in mud and silt. With decay slowed, their forms endured long enough to be compressed into peat, and over millions of years, that peat hardened into coal. Within these carbon-rich layers, fossils were sealed away, often flattened yet still recognizable, offering rare chances to study species that might otherwise have vanished without a trace. Scientists can read the layers of coal and shale much like chapters in a book. Bands rich in plant fossils suggest times when the forests were dense and thriving. Other layers, marked with charcoal, speak of fire sweeping through swamps and leaving blackened remains behind. Still others record interruptions caused by droughts or flooding, showing the delicate balance of the ecosystem. These subtle variations help reconstruct not just what lived in the Carboniferous, but how the environment shifted around them. Among the finds are amphibian skeletons, preserved with skulls and limb bones intact. These fossils reveal how early amphibians ranged in size from small, salamander-like animals to larger, more robust species adapted to hunting in the swamps. Reptile fossils, though rarer, have also been uncovered, offering glimpses of the first steps toward life that no longer depended on water for survival. Together, these discoveries chart the expanding complexity of vertebrate life, recorded in the very rock that formed from their habitats. The fossils of the Carboniferous are not only important for what they show, but for the way they were preserved. The coal seams act like vaults, protecting and compressing the remains of entire forests and their inhabitants. Each impression, each trackway, each delicate wing tells us about the sheer diversity of life and the abundance that filled those ancient swamps. Through these preserved fragments, scientists can reconstruct ecosystems that were as rich and dynamic as any rainforest today, yet built on plants and animals utterly different from those we know. From the depths of coal mines to carefully studied nodules in museums, the treasures of the Carboniferous continue to reveal the story of a world where life grew on a monumental scale. These fossils serve as a record not just of individuals, but of entire environments, preserved by chance and by the unique conditions of ancient swamps. And as scientists uncover more, they see the traces of a world still in flux, about to undergo changes that would challenge even its most remarkable giants. The fossils pulled from coal seams reveal an age of giants, creatures that stretched the limits of what life could be. Yet even as dragonflies with wings as wide as a human arm took to the skies, and millipedes longer than a person's body crawled across the forest floor, there were boundaries that life could not cross. Gigantism had its wonders, but it also had its limits, shaped not only by the environment, but by the very architecture of the creatures themselves. Insects and their relatives are built around exoskeletons, a design of hard outer shells made of chitin that both protect and support the body. For small creatures, this design works beautifully. A beetle can carry many times its own weight because the strength of its exoskeleton scales well with its tiny size. But as the body grows larger, the balance between weight and support begins to shift. The mass of the creature increases faster than the strength of its outer shell, and at a certain point, the structure simply cannot keep up. The more massive the body, the greater the stress placed on each joint, each segment, and each supporting plate of armor. Arthropleura, the giant millipede of the Carboniferous, reached lengths of more than 2 meters, but it was still bound by these rules. Its body had to remain close to the ground, spreading its weight across many legs to distribute the strain. This sprawling design allowed it to move with surprising stability, but it also meant that creatures like it could never rise tall, like vertebrates with internal skeletons. An exoskeleton large enough to support an upright giant would have been impossibly thick and heavy, trapping the animal beneath its own armor. Flying insects faced their own constraints. The dragonfly-like Meganeura had wings nearly 70 centimeters across, but wings larger than that would have been too heavy to flap, even in the oxygen-rich air of the Carboniferous. The mechanics of flight demand a balance of lift, thrust, and weight. Exceeding those balances would ground the insect, making it vulnerable to predators and unable to survive. Even in a world that favored large body sizes, physics set firm boundaries. The limits of gigantism can also be seen when comparing arthropods with vertebrates. Vertebrates grow larger more easily because their skeletons are internal, made of bone and reinforced by muscles that attach directly to them. Bones can thicken and strengthen as animals grow, supporting more weight without becoming unmanageable. This is why dinosaurs could rise to enormous sizes, while arthropods reached a ceiling much lower, their exoskeletons simply unable to scale in the same way. The giants of the Carboniferous were spectacular, but they were already near the upper edge of what their bodies could allow. Modern arthropods reveal these same constraints. The largest land-dwelling arthropod alive today is the coconut crab, which can grow more than a meter across, but still remains far smaller than its Carboniferous cousins. Even in the oceans, where buoyancy lessens the effect of gravity, crabs, lobsters, and sea spiders reach impressive but limited sizes. No modern insect approaches the span of Meganeura, and no living millipede stretches anywhere near the length of Arthropleura. The world has changed, but the rules of scaling remain the same. The Carboniferous provided a unique environment that allowed arthropods to push against these boundaries. Higher oxygen levels fueled larger bodies, and humid forests offered stable conditions. But the ceiling was always there, waiting. The exoskeleton could not grow forever, wings could not extend indefinitely, and weight could not be carried without limit. Each creature was an experiment in balance, a dance between opportunity and constraint. These limits did not diminish their reign. Instead, they made it all the more remarkable. The giants of the Carboniferous were living examples of how life stretches to the edge of possibility, filling every niche until it meets the invisible walls set by physics and biology. Those boundaries shaped not only their lives, but also their eventual decline, for when conditions shifted, the balance tipped against them. And the fossils, pressed into stone, record this delicate equilibrium. They show us bodies that grew as large as they could, but no larger, held in place by natural laws that have not changed in hundreds of millions of years. Even now, when we see the largest insects alive today, we are reminded of those ancient limits and of the brief time when Earth itself allowed creatures to approach them. The Carboniferous world had given insects and their relatives a chance to grow into giants, filling skies and forests with creatures that seemed almost impossible by today's standards. Yet the fossil record tells us that this age of enormous forms did not last forever. Layer by layer, in stone and coal, there are signs that something was shifting. The remains of the largest dragonflies, millipedes, and scorpions become less frequent with time, while smaller relatives begin to dominate the strata. It is as if nature had slowly dimmed the light on the stage, letting the giants exit quietly as new actors took their place. In the oldest beds, the fossils of creatures like Meganeura and Arthropleura are found with striking clarity, their impressions large enough to command attention. But in younger deposits, fewer of these colossal forms appear. Instead, wings of dragonflies grow shorter, the segments of millipedes become narrower, and the traces left in mudstone shrink in scale. This was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation, spread out over millions of years. The patterns suggest that gigantism was being edged out, replaced by lineages better suited to new conditions. Across different regions, the same trend emerges. In what is now Europe, coal seams that once revealed abundant remains of large arthropods begin to yield smaller species as time passed. In North America, trackways once carved by meter-long millipedes vanish from the record, replaced by the delicate footprints of more modest creatures. The transition was global, not confined to one valley or one swamp, but playing out across continents separated by shallow seas and shifting coastlines. The story is written in multiple places at once, pointing to broad forces rather than isolated accidents. Clues within the rocks suggest that environmental stress may have been building. Coal seams thin out in certain intervals, hinting that the vast swamp forests were shrinking, reducing the habitats where giant arthropods once thrived. Fossilized charcoal becomes more common in some layers, evidence of frequent fires that may have fragmented forests and altered the balance of ecosystems. And isotopic signatures in the rocks point to changes in atmospheric composition, a hint that oxygen levels, once so high, might have begun to decline. For giants dependent on rich air and dense forests, these subtle shifts would have been profound. The disappearance of the giants was not absolute. Insects and arthropods as a group continued to thrive, but in smaller forms. Cockroaches, for example, were still abundant, yet the individuals found in later deposits were no longer of extraordinary size. Dragonflies still darted across ponds, but their wings no longer stretched to the width of a seagull. The millipedes that scurried through the leaf litter became shorter and thinner, their massive ancestors fading into memory. It is as though nature had set a new boundary, pushing life back within the limits that could be sustained in a changing world. The fossil record is not only about what is preserved, but also about what disappears. The absence of large trackways in once favored environments, the decline of massive wing impressions in shale, the lack of oversized exoskeleton fragments in later seams, all point to the same conclusion. These were the whispers of a world under strain, where the rules that had once allowed giants to flourish were quietly being rewritten. The decline of the largest arthropods was not a mystery of sudden catastrophe, but of steady pressure, an environment shifting just enough to tip the scales. And as the giants dwindled, other creatures were waiting to take advantage of the openings left behind. Amphibians and reptiles, already spreading in number, found fewer competitors for resources. The ecosystems of the late Carboniferous were becoming more complex, shaped not only by growth but also by loss. The stage was being set for new dramas, even as the towering figures of the insect world left fewer and fewer traces in stone. The decline of Earth's great arthropods is written not only in their fading fossils, but also in the invisible chemistry locked deep within stone. Around 305 million years ago, the rocks begin to tell a quieter story than bones or wings can show. Buried in their layers are clues that the air itself was changing, a slow reduction in the very oxygen that once made life larger than imagination. This shift was not sudden like a storm, nor explosive like a volcanic eruption. It was a decline that crept across millions of years, steady and implacable, reshaping the limits of life, one breath at a time. Geologists trace this change through multiple kinds of evidence. In coal seams, the sheer abundance of plant matter begins to dwindle, signaling the shrinking of the vast swamp forests that had acted as oxygen factories for so long. In isotopic signatures preserved in minerals, the ratios of carbon and other elements record subtle but unmistakable trends, showing how the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide tilted as forests faltered. Even the microscopic structure of ancient charcoal hints at atmospheric composition, offering a proxy for how intense fire could burn in a given age. Put together, these signs show the same message. The Carboniferous high oxygen atmosphere had peaked, and the long descent had begun. For the great insects and millipedes of the time, the implications were direct and unforgiving. Their tracheal breathing systems, those branching tubes that brought oxygen directly into their tissues, functioned only as long as the surrounding air held enough to sustain them. As oxygen levels dropped, the margin for survival narrowed. A dragonfly with wings spanning 70 centimeters needed immense muscular output to stay aloft, and those muscles demanded oxygen. As the concentration in the atmosphere thinned, the diffusion that once flowed easily into their tissues could no longer keep pace. The biggest individuals struggled first, their vast bodies asking more of the air than the air could give. The fossil record reflects this struggle. In earlier Carboniferous layers, wings of Meganeura spread across stone like stained glass windows, each vein etched in detail. By the later layers, those giant wings vanish, replaced by more modest forms, with spans no greater than those of large modern dragonflies. The same pattern appears on the ground, where the immense trackways of arthropleura once wound across mud. Later sediments preserve smaller trails, their width and depth speaking of creatures a fraction of the size. These are not random absences. They mark a consistent trend where gigantism receded in step with the atmosphere's retreat. The physiological burden on large insects went beyond simple size. With less oxygen available, their activity would have been curtailed. Flight, once effortless in the supercharged air, became costly. Muscles that powered rapid wing beats grew fatigued more quickly. On the forest floor, long-bodied millipedes that had once rippled across the undergrowth now risked suffocation in tissues too far from a spiracle. Even scorpions and centipedes that had expanded their forms to impressive proportions faced the same limit, their bodies no longer efficiently served by diffusion alone. In a sense, the environment was squeezing them from the inside out. Smaller species, however, weathered the decline with resilience. Their tracheal systems were short, their oxygen demands modest, and the thinning air still gave them more than enough to thrive. These smaller insects filled ecological roles left empty by their giants. While the forests lost their towering arthropod rulers, they gained swarms of adaptable survivors, creatures that could dart, crawl, and burrow without being constrained by the invisible ceiling pressing down on their larger cousins. Diversity endured, but the scale of life shifted downward. What makes this oxygen crash remarkable is not its speed, but its persistence. Across millions of years, the steady decline reshaped ecosystems with the inevitability of tides. Animals and plants did not experience it as a sudden catastrophe, but as a gradual tightening of possibilities. The forests that had once echoed with the wingbeats of dragonfly titans grew quieter. The mud that bore the marks of colossal millipedes now carried only lighter imprints. Entire ecological webs restructured themselves around smaller bodies and shorter lifespans. The geological record shows that this was a planetary event, not an isolated local collapse. In Europe, North America, and Asia, the same signals appear, synchronized across continents that were then fused into a single supercontinent. The fall of oxygen was global, a shift in Earth's breath that no creature could outrun. For the giants of the Carboniferous, it spelled the end of a unique experiment in scale. Yet this was not the end of change. Even as oxygen levels fell, the continents themselves were drying, climates were shifting, and new vertebrate competitors were pressing into niches once dominated by insects. The Great Oxygen Crash was only one strand in a tangle of pressures that together brought the age of arthropod giants to a close. The fall in oxygen that marked the late Carboniferous was not an isolated event. It was tied directly to the fate of the forests themselves, those endless swamps of towering lycophytes, seed ferns, and giant horsetails that had once defined the equator. For millions of years, these coal forests had stretched across continents, moist, dense, and stable, feeding the atmosphere with oxygen and building the conditions for gigantism. But stability on Earth is never permanent. The climate began to shift, and with it the foundations of these green empires began to crumble. Evidence from fossil soils and sediments points to a change in rainfall patterns. Where the swamps had once been saturated year-round, widespread droughts began to cut through the humid equatorial belt. The lush wetlands dried into patches, rivers shrank, and the great floodplains that once supported endless forests fractured into smaller, disconnected refuges. It was not a single dry spell, but a recurring pattern, seasons of stress layered over one another until the forests could no longer recover. This event, known to scientists as the Carboniferous Rainforest collapse, unfolded around 305 million years ago. It was one of the most dramatic ecological disruptions in Earth's history. Vast stretches of tropical swamp, once teeming with life, disappeared within a relatively short geological window. The forests that had dominated the landscape for tens of millions of years were reduced to fragments scattered across what had once been continuous green expanses. The impact on plant diversity was stark. Fossil records show a sharp decline in the giant lycophytes, those towering club moss trees that had formed the backbone of the coal forests. Many of these species disappeared entirely, unable to adapt to the drier conditions. Ferns and seed ferns managed to hold on in patches, but the uniform, dense canopies of the Carboniferous gave way to mosaics of smaller, less diverse plant communities. Where once the forest floor had been shadowed by trunks as tall as buildings, open spaces appeared, broken by shrubs and lower vegetation. For the insects and arthropods that had evolved within these lush, humid environments, the collapse was devastating. Their lives were entwined with the forests, from the dragonflies that hunted along the swampy margins, to the millipedes that fed on the thick mats of fallen leaves, to the scorpions that lurked in the damp undergrowth. As forests shrank and wetlands dried, habitats disappeared. The giants that depended on vast, stable ecosystems were hit hardest, while smaller and more adaptable species found ways to persist in the scattered refuges that remained. Fossil sites tell the story in detail. In earlier Carboniferous deposits, The remains of insects are abundant, diverse, and often large. In the layers that follow the collapse, that abundance fades, the variety of forms decreases, and the scale of individual species shrinks. Trackways vanish from regions where they had once been common, and the impressions of wings grow fewer. It is a portrait of loss, written not in sudden catastrophe, but in the slow retreat of ecosystems under stress. The collapse of the coal forests reshaped more than just insects. Amphibians, once thriving in swampy environments, also suffered as their watery homes disappeared. Many lineages dwindled or vanished, leaving only a few survivors. Reptiles, with their protective eggs and greater independence from water, fared better, taking advantage of the open habitats and the new conditions. The fall of the forests created spaces where reptiles could spread, setting the stage for their long-term rise. The coal forests did not vanish entirely. In some sheltered valleys and along certain river systems, pockets of rainforest endured for a time, acting as refuges for species clinging to survival. But the continuous green belt of the Carboniferous was gone, replaced by patchier, drier landscapes. The coal seams that formed during this era are the final testimony of these vanished forests, layers of black rock storing the memory of their abundance. The collapse was a turning point, not only for plants, but for every creature that depended on them. It marked the end of an age when insects could rule the land as giants, and the beginning of a more fragmented, more competitive world. And as the forests faded, the climate itself shifted further, bringing new challenges that would continue to test the resilience of life. The collapse of the coal forests left scars not only in the fossil record, but in the climate itself. Once, the Carboniferous had been a world of steady warmth and heavy humidity, its equatorial belt wrapped in nearly constant moisture. But as the forests fell away, the atmosphere and land began to change in tandem. The vast swamp belts that had acted like natural humidifiers no longer held the same grip on rainfall. Gradually, the planet shifted toward a climate that was drier and more seasonal, with periods of rain giving way to longer spells of drought. The balance that had once allowed giant arthropods and water-bound amphibians to flourish was fading, replaced by a harsher rhythm. In the geological record, this change appears in subtle but unmistakable ways. Sediment layers that once showed continuous swamp deposits begin to break into alternating bands, signaling dry intervals when forests retreated and floodplains cracked beneath the sunlight. Ancient soils, hardened into rock, show features of desiccation, with patterns that speak of surfaces exposed to long dry seasons. Coal seams grow thinner and patchier, evidence that the great swamps were shrinking into isolated pockets rather than spreading across continents as they once had. The Earth's memory of drying is written into stone, preserved in every ripple and crack. For amphibians, this shift was deeply disruptive. Their bodies, so well suited to damp and watery worlds, depended on constant access to moisture. Their eggs, soft and unprotected, still required pools and wetlands to survive. As swamps dried, their habitats fractured. Fossils of amphibians, once widespread and abundant, become rarer in regions that turn dry, clustered instead around what remained of the water. Their diversity fell sharply, with many lineages disappearing altogether, leaving behind only those few that could cling to life in shrinking aquatic refuges. Insects too faced new struggles. The giants of the Carboniferous had already been constrained by oxygen decline, but the drying of the land compounded their troubles. Species that depended on dense, humid vegetation found fewer safe havens. Trackways and wing impressions in younger strata reveal smaller forms dominating the record, while the colossal creatures that had once defined the Carboniferous grew scarce. The once unbroken continuity of insect life gave way to patchier distributions, scattered where humidity persisted. The forests that had powered their rise no longer supported the same abundance. Yet while amphibians and insects faltered, reptiles found opportunity. Their innovation, the amniotic egg, meant that they no longer needed water to reproduce. Their scaled skin helped them retain moisture, shielding them against dry air and seasonal drought. Fossils of early reptiles, once rare, begin to appear in greater numbers as the late Carboniferous gave way to the Permian. They expanded into new habitats that amphibians could not reach, spreading into uplands, drier valleys, and open woodlands. Where amphibians were confined to what water remained, reptiles could venture far from it, feeding on insects, plants, and smaller vertebrates in landscapes that were becoming increasingly open and arid. The rise of reptiles during this time is not seen as an abrupt replacement, but as a gradual shift in balance. While amphibians still dominated in wet regions, reptiles thrived in the drier margins, filling niches that were expanding with every passing century. Fossils from Europe and North America reveal their growing presence, from small lizard-like forms to early ancestors of lineages that would one day give rise to crocodiles, lizards, and even dinosaurs. The drying of the continents did not simply strip life away. It carved new ecological spaces, and reptiles were among the first to seize them. The shrinking of swamp regions can be traced in exquisite detail through fossilized plants. In older Carboniferous layers, the remains of lycophyte giants dominate, their trunks and roots forming dense mats that testify to endless wetlands. But as the climate shifted, these remains give way to plants adapted to drier conditions. Seed ferns and conifers, with tougher reproductive strategies and less reliance on constant moisture, began to spread. This botanical turnover mirrored the animal world, with reptiles expanding as amphibians and insects pulled back. The drying of the continents was not a single event, but a drawn-out transformation, shaping the path of life for millions of years. It marked the decline of one era and the preparation for another, an age when reptiles would step forward into dominance, and when the ecosystems of the earth would take on a new face. And even as the climate hardened, other forces were stirring in these landscapes, including the rise of new predators and the competition for skies that had once belonged only to insects. By the later stages of the Carboniferous, the world was no longer a place where insects and arthropods lived with near impunity. The forests had once sheltered them in overwhelming abundance, but as climates shifted and landscapes fractured, other creatures grew sharper, faster, and hungrier. What had begun as scattered experiments in vertebrate life was turning into a coordinated press of predators, each honing strategies that chipped away at the dominance of the giants. The balance of power was tilting, and insects felt the pressure from every direction. Amphibians, though increasingly confined to habitats with reliable water, refined their bodies into more specialized forms. Fossil skulls from this time reveal stronger jaws, their hinges reinforced to clamp down with force, and their teeth more pointed, able to pierce through the hard cuticles of arthropods. Some amphibians grew flatter, with broad bodies that allowed them to vanish against muddy banks or beneath mats of vegetation, perfect for lying in wait. Their eyes shifted higher on their skulls, a subtle but significant adaptation that let them watch while remaining submerged, waiting motionless until an unwary insect drew close. These refinements turned once generalist hunters into masters of ambush, their stillness as lethal as their strike. Reptiles, newer to the scene, were not limited by water the way amphibians were. Their innovations in reproduction and physiology allowed them to scatter into a wider range of niches, and with each expansion came new diets and hunting styles. Fossil teeth tell the story clearly. Some species bore sharp, needle-like fangs designed to puncture the armor of beetles or cockroaches. Others carried broader, serrated edges, capable of slicing through vegetation or tearing softer prey. Still others had stout, crushing jaws that could handle eggs or shelled insects. This diversification was not just about size or form, but about flexibility. Reptiles were no longer tied to a single food source. They were opportunists, adjusting their menu as the environment shifted. For insects, this meant constant threat. On damp forest floors, amphibians could wait unseen, jaws poised to snap. In shallow waters that once felt safe, predators with paddle tails lunged upward. On drier ground, reptiles prowled with nimble bodies and teeth adapted to almost anything they encountered. Even the air above, once ruled without challenge by dragonflies and other aerial hunters, was no longer free of competition. Some reptiles were beginning to climb trees, using elevated perches to strike at insects that once skimmed the canopy in safety. What had been a world of dominance was becoming a world of vigilance. This mounting complexity marked the beginning of ecological arms races. Amphibians perfected their ambush techniques. Insects countered by developing better camouflage, their wings patterned like bark or mottled leaves. Reptiles diversified their diets. Insects responded with tougher exoskeletons, small fortresses of chitin that resisted piercing teeth. In some lineages, speed itself became the defense, with flight paths that darted erratically, confounding pursuit. Every step forward for predators demanded a response from prey, and every adjustment by prey spurred predators to innovate further. The fossil record captures the quiet echoes of this contest. Wing impressions show increasingly intricate vein networks, structures that may have added strength or agility in flight. Mandibles grew varied, hinting at insects evolving not only to exploit new plants, but also to defend against bites. Amphibian remains show jaws thickened with muscle attachments, while reptiles left behind skeletons in a broader array of forms, each suited to a slightly different way of hunting or surviving. Seen together, they map a web of interactions, millions of years long, in which no species could stand still while others advanced. This rise of predatory pressure transformed ecosystems. Giant arthropods that once spread unchallenged across swamps now lived in landscapes where stealth, speed, and armor were tested daily. It was no longer enough to be big, or even to be abundant. To endure, insects had to adapt to predators that could strike from multiple sides, on ground, in water, and even from the trees. What emerged was a world of constant contest, one in which the great giants of the Carboniferous were squeezed not only by the air they breathed and the climates that dried their forests, but by jaws, claws, and strategies that grew sharper with time. And just as the ground became more dangerous, so too would the skies, as vertebrates began to test the air itself, probing a realm insects had long ruled alone. For tens of millions of years, the air belonged entirely to insects. They were the first to break the boundary between earth and sky, the first to beat wings against the heavy carboniferous air, and the first to master the invisible highways above the forest canopy. Dragonflies like Meganeura hovered with precision, their wide wings glinting as they patrolled the swamps. Clouds of smaller insects darted and shimmered through shafts of sunlight, filling the atmosphere with motion. In those early forests, the hum of wings was a constant presence, and for a long time there was no rival in sight. But nothing in nature stays unchallenged forever. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, vertebrates began to probe the skies. They did not arrive as full flyers like the birds or bats of later ages, but as tentative experimenters, pushing the limits of bodies built for the ground. Some amphibians developed broad, flattened forms, their skin stretched into membranes that caught the air as they leapt between branches. Early reptiles took the experiment further, extending their ribs into frames that supported gliding surfaces, delicate sails that allowed them to drift short distances. These were not masters of the sky, but their presence signaled the first fractures in the insect's monopoly. For the giants of the insect world, this intrusion was profound. A dragonfly in the Carboniferous sky once had to watch for dangers only from below, the snap of amphibian jaws at the water's surface, or the sudden lunge of a hunter from the undergrowth. But with vertebrates beginning to glide, danger could now arrive from above or from the side, cutting across the open air. The skies, once a sanctuary where only insects had freedom, became an arena of shared space. The fossil record gives us glimpses of this transition. In older Carboniferous deposits, giant wings of dragonflies are preserved in abundance, their breadth and symmetry testifying to their dominance. Yet in younger strata, these large wings appear less often, while smaller, more agile forms become more common. The venation of insect wings in these later layers grows increasingly intricate, stiffening membranes for sharper turns and faster reactions. This suggests that insects were adapting under pressure, forced to refine their aerial skills in response to new challenges from vertebrate competitors who were learning, however clumsily, to share their realm. Evidence of vertebrate gliders also emerges in the stone. One of the clearest examples comes from Coelurosaurus, a reptile whose elongated ribs fanned outward to support membranes like wings. Although it lived in the Permian, its specialized body points back to experiments already underway during the Carboniferous. Amphibians, such as Ichthyosaurus and other early leapers, show the same principle: the ability to use air not just as a barrier to fall through, but as a medium to navigate. Each of these creatures represents a step in the gradual encroachment of vertebrates into the insect's once exclusive kingdom. The consequences for insects were severe, particularly for the giants. A body designed for strength and stability in oxygen-rich air was no match for a glider that could sweep down from above. Large wings beat with steady power, but lacked the quickness to dodge a sudden aerial strike. Smaller insects, on the other hand, could twist and dart, their tiny frames giving them agility the giants could not match. In a sky that was no longer safe, size shifted from advantage to liability. This was the beginning of a new kind of evolutionary arms race, one not confined to land or water but fought in open air. Insects refined their wings for sharper maneuvers, perfected hovering, and in some cases developed camouflage even in flight. Vertebrates experimented with longer glides, stronger membranes, and better control, gradually learning how to turn falling into soaring. The sky, once ruled by insects alone, had become a contested frontier, reshaped by competition. The monopoly of the dragonfly titans was gone forever. They did not vanish all at once, but their dominance ebbed as vertebrates claimed a share of the air. From that point onward, no single group would ever hold complete control of the skies again. The air had become a shared space, its freedom tested by multiple kinds of wings, and while insects adjusted to the new demands of aerial life, the ground below was also changing. Fires grew more frequent as climates dried, and once unbroken forests began to fragment into scattered patches. The challenges facing these ancient creatures were not only in the air, but across the very landscapes they inhabited. As the skies above grew more crowded with new competitors, The ground below was unraveling in ways that were just as transformative. The Carboniferous world, once dominated by vast unbroken belts of swamp forest stretching along the equator, began to fracture under the weight of a drying climate. Seasons lengthened, rainfall patterns grew less predictable, and long stretches of dryness began to carve new rhythms into the land. Where once the air had been perpetually heavy with moisture, drought now pressed its way into the heart of the coal forests. And with those drier intervals came a new pattern of disturbance that changed the face of the landscape: fire. In the earliest Carboniferous, the forests of lycophytes, horsetails, and giant ferns resisted flames. Their dense, waterlogged tissues and constantly humid environments kept sparks from spreading. But as climates shifted, the defenses of these swamp giants began to fail. Periods of dryness lowered the moisture in vegetation, and when lightning struck, flames no longer fizzled at the edges but advanced deeper into the canopy. What had once been rare, isolated burns became frequent interruptions, carving scars into the very ecosystems that had fueled the oxygen boom of the age. The greatest impact of these fires was not in the immediate destruction they caused, but in the fragmentation that followed. The coal forests had once formed continuous green corridors where insects, amphibians, and early reptiles could move freely, finding food and shelter across vast ranges. After repeated fires, those forests broke into disconnected patches. Pockets of swamp and forest persisted, but they were surrounded by open expanses of charred ground or drier, less hospitable terrain. The world that had once been seamless now resembled a patchwork quilt, its pieces shrinking with each new disturbance. This fragmentation carried consequences for every group of organisms. Amphibians, still dependent on wet habitats for survival, found their ranges restricted to isolated wetlands and floodplains. Populations that had once mingled across wide territories became separated, their genetic diversity narrowing as groups became confined to smaller refuges. Insects, too, faced new challenges. The giants of the air, like Meganeura, once able to hunt over endless swamp canopies, found themselves with fewer continuous stretches to patrol. Their prey was scattered, and the open spaces between forest patches exposed them to new risks. On the forest floor, colossal millipedes and scorpions lost the shaded, moist expanses that had sustained their numbers, forcing them into smaller niches or driving them toward decline. The fires also reshaped the very structure of ecosystems. In places where the flames cleared vegetation, fast-growing plants surged in afterward, reclaiming ground in waves of new growth. Some species adapted to these cycles, producing spores or seeds that thrived in disturbed soils. But the great lycophyte trees and other swamp specialists were less resilient. They had evolved in a world of constant humidity and continuous canopy cover, and their recovery lagged behind the pace of fire and drought. Each time flames passed through, the remaining forests grew weaker, more fragmented, less capable of sustaining the giants that once depended on them. The patchwork landscapes that emerged favored smaller, more adaptable creatures. Insects that could live in scattered habitats, feed on diverse resources, or reproduce quickly had an edge over the massive specialists of earlier times. Vertebrates, too, exploited the new openness. Reptiles, with their independence from water, could move between fragmented habitats more easily than amphibians or arthropods. Predatory opportunities multiplied in these transitional zones, where prey had no dense canopy to shield them. The fragmentation of the forests did not just reduce space, it altered the very dynamics of survival. Rock layers from this time preserve the imprint of these cycles, Alternating bands of plant fossils and ash suggest forests repeatedly burned and regrew, but never fully reclaimed the seamless expanses they once held. Trackways of arthropods and amphibians appear in localized patches rather than across continuous surfaces, hinting at how fragmented their worlds had become. The geological story is not one of a single, overwhelming catastrophe, but of ecosystems gradually pulled apart until the balance that had supported gigantism could no longer hold. This fracturing of the Carboniferous landscape was one of the quiet forces that helped end the age of insect giants. No single blaze ended their reign, but the steady rhythm of fire and fragmentation narrowed their habitats, disrupted their cycles, and left them increasingly vulnerable to other pressures already mounting in the skies and in the soil. And as the forests shrank into scattered enclaves, the creatures of that age were forced to adapt or fade away. In this broken world, survival no longer favored size or dominance but flexibility. The stage was being prepared for smaller arthropods and for vertebrates that could traverse the fragmented terrain, setting the course for the transformations yet to come. The fire-scorched forests and shrinking wetlands of the late Carboniferous had already pushed many of the largest arthropods to the edge. The atmosphere itself was changing, with oxygen levels falling from their ancient peak, and this decline struck hardest at the bodies of the giants. Their tracheal tubes, once flooded with oxygen-rich air, no longer carried enough of it to power wings nearly a meter across or to feed muscles moving bodies longer than a grown human. Yet, even as the titans disappeared, insects as a group endured. Their survival was carried forward not by size or strength, but by the smallest among them. Smaller insects had an advantage in a low oxygen world. Their breathing system, based on the diffusion of gases through delicate tubes, works efficiently when the distance between the outside air and internal tissues is short. A tiny body requires only a modest supply of oxygen to function, and even as the air thinned, that supply remained enough to keep them active. Larger bodies demanded more oxygen than the atmosphere could provide, but smaller ones found balance. In this sense, the shift in climate and atmosphere did not erase insects as a whole, it reshaped them, favoring those that could live well within the new limits. Adaptability also became a defining trait. Small insects reproduced more quickly, with life cycles measured in weeks or months rather than years. This rapid turnover meant that their populations could adjust to changing conditions faster than larger, slower breeding species. If drought reshaped a habitat or fire cleared a forest patch, small insects could recolonize it within a short span of time, carrying their lineages forward. Their very abundance allowed them to endure losses that would have devastated rarer, larger species. Their diets added another layer of resilience. While the great millipede Arthropleura consumed thick layers of decaying plant matter and the giant dragonflies needed stable populations of prey, smaller insects could live on almost anything. Some fed on spores or pollen grains, others on tiny fragments of decaying vegetation, still others on the smallest invertebrates. This flexibility meant that as ecosystems fractured and specialized niches collapsed, many small insects simply shifted their focus, surviving where the giants could not. Fossil evidence shows this transition clearly. In the younger Carboniferous layers, the huge wings and trackways become rare, while smaller insect fossils continue to appear in great variety. By the time the Permian period began, lineages of beetles, cockroaches, and early relatives of grasshoppers were already established. These groups, many of which still have descendants alive today, reveal how successful small-bodied forms were at navigating the New World. Their ability to persist and adapt allowed them to cross the boundary between two geological ages that marked the end of one empire and the beginning of another. The endurance of small insects also influenced the creatures that hunted them. Reptiles, growing more diverse in the drier Permian landscapes, relied heavily on the swarms of small insects for food. Amphibians, reduced in number but still present in wet pockets, also turned to them as prey. The very survival of these vertebrates was tied to the resilience of insects, even in diminished form. The giants had been spectacular, but it was the swarms of small bodies that kept ecosystems functioning, feeding those who would one day rise to dominate the earth. The story of insect survival is one of humility as much as grandeur. It was not the towering forms with the most dramatic presence that endured, but the quiet, unassuming creatures that could bend with the winds of change. Their legacy is visible in every corner of the modern world, where insects remain the most numerous and diverse group of animals on the planet. The lines of beetles, roaches, flies, and countless others trace back through deep time to those survivors of the late Carboniferous, the ones who proved that small size, adaptability, and persistence could succeed where strength and scale could not. And while the forests shifted and the climate hardened, even the most colossal of the Carboniferous arthropods left faint echoes of their final days, reminders etched into stone of what had once been possible. The story of Arthropleura does not end in a dramatic clash with predators, nor in a single catastrophic event. Instead, its passing was marked by silence, by the slow erasure of its presence from the landscapes it once dominated. The creature itself has never been found in a complete fossilized skeleton. What we have are its footsteps, broad furrows pressed into ancient mud, preserved as stone trackways. These traces are among the most haunting relics of the Carboniferous world, for they speak of a giant that vanished without leaving a body behind, its movements recorded only in fleeting moments when the ground was soft and the air still carried enough oxygen to sustain its bulk. The trackways tell us much about its final chapter. Some are long and deliberate, stretching across what were once swamp margins, as though the animal was searching for food in a world that was offering less of it. Others curve back upon themselves, looping across drying mudflats that may have bordered shrinking wetlands. Each impression, broad and shallow, suggests a creature still moving steadily, but within an environment that was shifting beneath it. Where once its trails crossed endless mats of damp forest litter, they became confined to patches, cut off by fire scars, drier soils, and fragmented habitats. These tracks, when they finally disappear from the record, whisper of an animal that simply ran out of places to go. The collapse of the coal forest sealed its fate. The vast equatorial swamps that had nourished generations of Arthropleura were shrinking into fragments. Fires burned through the drying vegetation, droughts stretched longer, and the wet, oxygen-rich conditions that had once made gigantism possible receded. For smaller insects, these changes meant hardship, but not extinction. Their modest size allowed them to persist in scattered refuges, feeding on what remained. Arthropleura, however, was bound to abundance. Its massive frame could not be supported by dwindling litter, and so its very design became a liability. In a patchwork world, a body that demanded constancy was no longer viable. Another force pressing down on the giant was the slow decline of atmospheric oxygen. Its breathing system relied on diffusion through networks of tubes, a method efficient only when oxygen was plentiful. For millions of years, that condition had been met, but as the forests fractured and carbon burial slowed, oxygen levels fell. For smaller arthropods, the decline was manageable. For a giant like Arthropleura, It was a physiological trap. Muscles that once moved it easily across the forest floor would have struggled to draw strength. Its body, so well suited to the heights of the Carboniferous, became unsustainable as the air itself thinned. The fossil record captures this decline in a way that feels almost mournful. Wide trackways are found in older Carboniferous deposits, confident impressions of a thriving species. As time moves forward, those traces grow fewer. By the early Permian, they vanish entirely, replaced by the lighter marks of smaller arthropods that would inherit the forest floor. There is no evidence of sudden extermination. Rather, Arthropleura's disappearance reads as a quiet retreat, a gradual loss written in absence. What makes its story especially poignant is that it left no direct descendants, other giants of its age left behind survivors. Dragonflies, though smaller, still skim the air. Cockroaches endure in countless forms, but the lineage of Arthropleura came to a complete halt. The millipedes of today, modest creatures curling in soil and under logs, are only distant cousins, echoes of a path evolution once explored and then abandoned. The end of Arthropleura was not just the end of a species, but the closing of an evolutionary experiment in gigantism. Its trackways, preserved in stone, are its final testimony. They remind us that even the most dominant beings of an age are bound to the limits of their environment. When the forests fragmented, when the air thinned, when the earth reshaped its climate, size became not an advantage, but a burden, and so Arthropleura passed quietly from the stage, leaving only the impressions of its many legs pressed into mud that hardened into rock. Those tracks are not simply relics of movement, they are the last whispers of a vanished world, a reminder that every rise carries within it the seed of its decline, and that even the largest creatures can disappear without a trace of their bodies, their story written only in the fleeting touch of their passing weight upon the earth. Beneath layers of stone, in seams of coal and bands of shale, lies a record not of living bodies, but of what once burned. It is not skeletons or shells that tell this part of Earth's story, but fragments of blackened plant tissue turned to charcoal and preserved for more than 300 million years. These tiny relics, fragile to the eye yet resilient through time, are the fingerprints of fire in the Carboniferous world. They are not ashes, which would have blown away in the first rains, but hardened residues, altered chemically in such a way that they could endure across geological ages. When geologists split open rocks from this era, they often find thin, dark streaks that stretch unbroken for kilometers. These streaks are more than discoloration. They are global markers, thin seams of fossil charcoal laid down when flames swept through swampy forests, thick with lycophytes and giant horsetails. To see them stacked one atop another, layer by layer, is to watch the memory of ancient firestorms accumulate like entries in a diary written by the earth itself. Each layer marks not only the burning of vegetation, but also the presence of an atmosphere so oxygen-rich that such fires could ignite and spread with ease. Scientists studying these residues have discovered that charcoal is a faithful witness to atmospheric chemistry. Fires of the scale recorded in Carboniferous rocks could only have burned under oxygen levels far higher than those of the present day. The very presence of abundant charcoal in rocks of this age confirms what chemical analyses of isotopes already suggest, that oxygen concentrations once hovered near 30%, creating conditions in which damp forests could burn as readily as dry grass does today. When oxygen levels began to fall in the late Carboniferous, the layers of charcoal became thinner and less frequent, offering a geological signal of the atmospheric decline that reshaped life across the planet. The distribution of charcoal layers is not limited to one region. They are found across Europe, North America, and Asia, testifying to the global reach of Carboniferous wildfires. In some coal seams, charcoal fragments appear mixed with unburned plant remains, a mosaic of life and death sealed together in sediment. Elsewhere, entire horizons are dominated by blackened remains, thick enough to be visible even to miners working centuries before science explained their origin. These global layers reveal that fire was not a local accident of climate, but a recurring planetary force woven into the fabric of ecosystems that stretched around the equator. Within these charred remains are clues about the vegetation itself. The cellular structures of ferns and lycophytes can sometimes still be seen under a microscope, preserved with remarkable fidelity by the charring process. Leaves and stems, once green and alive, are reduced to carbon, but still carry the outlines of their veins. Through them, scientists glimpse not only the plants that burned, but the frequency and intensity of the fires that shaped their world. Each fragment is a snapshot of destruction, yet also a durable archive of ancient ecology. The significance of these fire residues extends beyond plants. By tracing when and where the layers appear, paleontologists can connect them to changes in animal life. Insects, which relied on dense and continuous canopies for food and shelter, faced the consequences of landscapes repeatedly stripped bare. Charcoal seams serve as indirect evidence of those challenges, showing when habitats were cleared, when forests were broken apart, and when the conditions that sustained giant arthropods began to unravel. What makes this evidence so striking is its endurance. While bones may crumble and soft bodies dissolve, charcoal is chemically stable. Once formed, it resists decay and can remain in the rock record indefinitely. This durability means that charcoal acts as a long-term recorder of environmental change, one of the clearest indicators that high oxygen once reigned, that forests repeatedly burned, and that the ecosystems of the Carboniferous were never as stable as their lush appearance might suggest. From a modern perspective, these thin black seams are easy to overlook, but to scientists, they are among the most telling fossils of the age. They are not just markers of catastrophe, but guides to the rhythms of Earth's deep atmosphere, the cycling of gases, and the balance between life and fire. Every fleck of fossil charcoal carries within it a story of a tree that once grew, a forest that once burned, and an atmosphere that was unlike any we know today. The role of fire residues, then, is not to show us the creatures that walked or flew, but to capture the invisible forces that govern their lives. They are geological signatures of instability, silent but enduring, etched into the coal and stone. And in their blackened fragments, we find proof that even in the height of abundance, the world was already carrying the seeds of change, waiting to be read by those who would one day split the rocks and search for meaning. As the Carboniferous world gave way to the shifting landscapes of the Permian, the balance of power on land began to tilt. Where once the giant insects had ruled the skies and the damp forest floors, a new lineage was rising with quiet persistence. Reptiles, small at first but armed with evolutionary tools that gave them freedom from waterlogged swamps, began to step forward as the dominant force in the changing world. Their success was not sudden, but steady, spreading like roots into every new niche the earth offered. The key to their rise lay in the egg. Unlike amphibians, whose young had to begin life in water, reptiles carried within them a remarkable innovation. Their amniotic eggs, sealed in protective shells and filled with their own supply of nutrients and moisture, were tiny self-contained worlds. They freed reptiles from the need to return to ponds and swamps to reproduce, allowing them to push into drier landscapes where amphibians and insects struggled. This independence meant that as the Carboniferous rainforests collapsed and the continents grew drier, reptiles were already prepared to claim the open ground. The forests that once rang with the rustling of dragonfly wings were breaking apart, leaving stretches of savanna-like terrain dotted with scrubby plants. In these new habitats, reptiles flourished. They were not tied to the dense humidity that giant arthropods required, nor were they as vulnerable to fire and drought. Their lungs could draw oxygen deep into their bodies, no matter how much the atmosphere shifted. They could travel farther, survive longer between meals, and adapt to a wider variety of climates. In the silence left by the retreat of the insect giants, reptiles filled the gaps with growing confidence. The fossil record reveals this slow transfer of dominance, where once the wide trackways of Arthropleura stamped across the mud, now the footprints of small reptiles begin to appear. Their trails curve and dart, marking the paths of creatures that hunted and foraged with new strategies. Some of the earliest reptiles fed on insects, snapping up the smaller species that had managed to endure the environmental upheavals. Others began experimenting with plant-based diets, their teeth adapting to the tough leaves and seeds of the drier landscapes. The diversification of their diets meant reptiles were not bound to a single ecological role. They could spread, adapt, and thrive where the giants could not. For the arthropods that remained, survival meant scaling down. Gigantism, once the hallmark of their success, was no longer possible in the thinner air and patchy forests of the Permian. Instead, insects and their relatives began to occupy more specialized roles. Cockroaches, already ancient in lineage, endured by becoming small generalists, able to feed on almost anything and live in almost any condition. Beetles began to appear in greater numbers, their hardened wing covers giving them protection and adaptability in harsher environments. Dragonflies shrank to modest sizes, but continued to patrol the skies as swift hunters. Ants and termites had yet to arrive, but the foundations of the arthropod resilience we know today were being laid in this age of transition. The ecosystems of the Permian took on a new character, where once endless swamps had stretched beneath towering lycophytes, now broad open plains and seasonal climates reigned. Reptiles evolved into many forms, from nimble insect hunters to larger herbivores that grazed on the tough vegetation of the time. With each passing million years, their presence grew stronger, while the memory of the insect giants faded further into the background of Earth's story. The new balance of power was not just about who ruled the land, but about how life itself adapted to a planet that was shifting beneath it. Reptiles claimed the mantle of dominance not by sheer size, but by flexibility and innovation. Arthropods, once giants, secured their future by becoming smaller, more diverse, and more adaptable than ever before. In this reshaping of life's hierarchy, the stage was set for the great dramas yet to come, when reptiles would not only rule the land, but eventually give rise to creatures that would stride with towering necks, thunderous steps, and wings that shadowed the ground. In the quiet depth of stone and coal, the giants of the Carboniferous still linger. Their bodies may have long since crumbled, their forests turned to shadowed seams beneath our feet, yet their presence endures in whispers carved into the earth itself. These are not just fossils or fragments, they are memories pressed into matter, reminders that there was once an age when insects ruled the skies, when millipedes spanned the forest floor like moving walls, and when the air itself was rich enough to sustain dreams of size beyond our imagination. The remains they left behind are more than relics of anatomy. A dragonfly's wing in stone is not only a trace of biology, it is a frozen breath of flight, a ghost of motion arrested mid-beat. When we look at its fine lattice of veins, delicate and precise even after hundreds of millions of years, we see not only the structure of an insect, but the shimmer of sunlight that once passed through it, the silent rhythm of wings cutting heavy carboniferous air. The trackways of Arthropleura are not simply parallel furrows in ancient mud. They are the pathways of a life lived, the physical memory of a journey across damp soil, of countless legs moving in patient unison. They are the script of an animal that vanished, but left its sentence etched in the ground. These imprints carry an emotional weight because they bridge imagination with reality. They tell us that the towering stories of giant insects are not fantasy. They happened, they were real, and they left their signatures for us to find. To hold a piece of fossilized plant with the outline of a fern frond, or to see the massive impression of a wing, is to touch a world so different from ours, yet bound to it by the same earth beneath our feet. In their silence, the fossils speak, reminding us that life has never been static. It surges, recedes, and transforms, sculpted by forces greater than itself. The legacy of these giants also lives in what they represent. They were the outcome of a unique balance between air, climate, and forest. Their scale was not just an accident of evolution, but the expression of a world tipped toward excess, where oxygen surged, forests sprawled, and life could test the edges of possibility. And when the balance shifted, they could not hold. Their disappearance is not merely a story of extinction, but a reminder of how even the greatest forms are fragile when the stage that sustains them begins to collapse. What makes their memory so haunting is that they did not leave descendants large enough to carry their story forward in living form. There is no dragonfly today with a wingspan the length of a hawk's, no millipede stretching farther than a human arm. Instead, we are left with echoes, small dragonflies darting over ponds, millipedes curling in damp soil, cockroaches hiding in crevices. These are the faintest reminders of ancestors that once defied scale, the diminished heirs of an age when gigantism was ordinary. Their legacy is carried not in their size, but in the continuity of their lineages, quiet survivors that remind us of grandeur long gone. And yet, perhaps the truest legacy of the Carboniferous giants is not in the creatures themselves, but in the questions they leave us with. Why did they grow so large, and why did they vanish so suddenly when conditions changed? What other forms of life, now unimaginable, might have existed in forgotten ages of the earth? Every fossil wing, every charred seam, every track pressed into stone is an invitation to wonder. It asks us to imagine not only the past, but also the future, where life might once again push boundaries we think are fixed. The giants are gone, but they endure in memory, in stone, and in the air we still breathe air that carries a legacy shaped in part by their forests and their fall. They are reminders that life is at once fleeting and eternal, fragile in form, yet enduring in influence. To reflect on their world is to recognize our place within a continuum of change, one chapter among many in Earth's great unfolding story. And in that recognition lies the quiet power of their legacy, not just in what they were, but in what they make us feel, wonder, and imagine. Even after centuries of study, the story of the Carboniferous giants does not feel finished. The rocks and coals of deep time have yielded wings as wide as a handspan, trackways that stretch like corridors across ancient mud, and fragments of forests that once breathed out more oxygen than any we know today. Yet for all the evidence gathered, the fall of the giants still resists a single explanation. Their disappearance reads less like a solved equation and more like a tapestry of threads that overlap, tangle, and leave gaps where the pattern frays. What we see in the fossil record is clear. The age of immense insects and colossal millipedes ended. What remains elusive is why it ended in the way it did, and why it ended so suddenly after thriving for millions of years. Oxygen is one thread, fire another, climate a third, predators a fourth. Each alone seems powerful enough to leave a mark, but the deeper scientists look, the more it seems likely that none of these forces acted in isolation. They were strands braided together, forming pressures too complex to untangle neatly. The oxygen story has long dominated the discussion, and with reason. Breath itself is life, and when the air thins, bodies falter. Yet even here, questions linger. Did oxygen fall steadily, giving insects time to adapt, or did it crash sharply, leaving the largest species gasping in an atmosphere that no longer sustained them? Were some insect groups better at coping than others, perhaps with more efficient tracheal systems or lifestyles that sheltered them from the worst of the change? The fossil record gives hints, but no definitive answers. Predation is another thread that refuses to resolve into clarity. Amphibians and reptiles were undoubtedly expanding their reach, yet we do not know how directly they contributed to insect decline. Did they drive the giants into retreat by constant pressure, or were they simply opportunists, taking advantage of an ecological gap that opened for other reasons? The bones of these early vertebrates show sharp jaws and strong limbs, but the story of what they hunted most often is still murky. The role of fire adds still more uncertainty. Charcoal layers show that blazes were common, but the frequency and severity remain matters of debate. Did repeated wildfires fragment insect habitats to the point where large species could no longer recover? Or did the forests rebound more quickly than we imagine, the insects faltering for other reasons entirely? The charred remains are undeniable, but their meaning is less certain. And then there is climate, drier seasons, shifting coastlines, and the collapse of coal forests reshaped the face of the earth. But here too, the details blur. Was climate the primary driver, or merely the stage upon which the other forces played? Did the giants vanish because their food chains were cut short by drought, or because the oxygen crash and predator pressure compounded the stress until survival was impossible? Each explanation carries weight, each explanation carries doubt. What scientists now suspect is that the end of the giants was not caused by one hand, but by many, each pushing a little until the balance tipped. Oxygen levels slipped, predators multiplied, forests burned, and climates dried. Together, these forces created a cascade, yet exactly how they aligned, and in what sequence, remains unknown. That uncertainty is not a failure of science, but its invitation. Every fossil wing uncovered, every charcoal seam studied, every isotopic signature measured is not just a data point but a clue. Somewhere, perhaps in an undiscovered fossil bed or a forgotten coal seam, may lie the evidence that clarifies whether oxygen decline struck first, or whether fire and climate had already set the collapse in motion. Until then, the mystery remains open, alive, and compelling. In this sense, the unanswered questions are part of the legacy themselves. They remind us that science is a process of pursuit, not finality. They remind us that Earth's history is written in fragments, and that what has been lost to time can sometimes be glimpsed only in outline. And they leave us with an image both haunting and beautiful, the silent wing of a dragonfly pressed into stone, whispering of a world that once was, and of questions that still wait in the shadows of rock, waiting to be asked again. When we look back across the Carboniferous world, it is difficult not to linger on the haunting image of forests alive with wings larger than a human arm and millipedes longer than a body. For tens of millions of years, these giants reigned with quiet certainty. They filled the skies, They pressed their marks into the mud, and they turned the very rhythm of the forests into a dance of wings, legs, and shadows. For a time, it must have seemed as though they would endure forever. Yet their reign ended not with a slow fading, but with a swift collapse, sudden and irrevocable, leaving behind only fragments for us to find. Their story lingers still, written not in ink but in stone. It lies in coal seams that run deep beneath our feet, in the fossilized wings that preserve every vein of once living flight, and in the trackways carved into mud that hardened over ages into rock. Even the air we breathe carries a trace of their story, for it was the rise and fall of oxygen that first allowed their bodies to stretch into impossible sizes and then force them back into limits. The giants are gone, yet the atmosphere itself remembers them. To reflect on their world is to recognize how delicate the balance of life has always been. The insects did not vanish because they were weak. They were masters of their age, perfectly adapted to a world that favored them. But when that world shifted, when fire, climate, predators, and air itself conspired against them, their mastery was undone. They remind us that dominance is never permanent, and that survival belongs not to the strongest or the largest, but to the most adaptable. Still, their shadows are not lost. Every dragonfly that skims the surface of a pond, every cockroach that scuttles into the dark, every beetle with its armor-like shell carries the legacy of that ancient time. They are smaller now, shaped by the air and climate of the present, but their ancestors once ruled entire continents. The whisper of their reign still lingers in the living descendants that persist all around us. To imagine that forgotten world is to walk through a forest of impossibility, where the air was thick enough to feed giants, where firestorms reshaped the land, and where life experimented with scale in ways that seem unreal today. It is to see how Earth itself is not static, but alive with cycles of expansion and collapse, giving rise to forms that dazzle, dominate, and then fade, leaving only echoes in the rocks. As we close this journey into Earth's forgotten age, perhaps the most striking lesson is that nothing in nature is wasted. The giants of the Carboniferous may be gone, but they have not been erased. They live on in the coal that fuels human progress, in the scientific questions that still push us to explore, and in the very fabric of our imagination. They are a reminder of how much life can change and how much it can endure. If this journey into the age of giant insects has sparked your wonder, I invite you to join again for more. There are always new mysteries to uncover, more forgotten worlds to step softly into, more stories written in stone, fire, and air. This little corner of science is for drifting into the unknown together, calmly, curiously, letting the vastness of time wrap around us like a blanket. So let us leave this forest of giants behind, knowing that it still hums beneath the earth, waiting in coal seams and fossils for the next pair of hands to turn over the stone and listen. And when we meet again, it will be for another mystery, another age, another journey into the deep and endless story of life on our planet.